Welcome back to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we leave the outside world behind and embark on a journey through the mist. I am taking you to Raven Island, a place where the rules of time change and deep secrets lie hidden. Throughout this 50-chapter saga, we will walk the dark corridors of the island together. Turn off the lights, find a comfortable position, and focus only on the flow of my voice. If you are ready, our story begins. Sleep well. The small boat moved slowly across the grey water. The sea was not calm. Large waves hit the side of the boat, and cold water splashed onto the deck. Sarah sat near the front and pulled her heavy coat tight around her body. The air was very cold, and it smelled like salt and wet wood. She looked back at her friends. Mark stood near the captain. He was a tall man with short hair and a serious face. He looked at the horizon with a look of deep thought. Clara sat next to Sarah. She looked very pale because the movement of the boat made her feel sick. David, a man with a large black camera, was busy taking pictures of the dark sky. "Are we almost there?" Clara asked. Her voice was very quiet. Mark pointed his finger toward a dark shape in the distance. "Look, there it is. Raven Island." The island appeared slowly through the mist. It was a lonely piece of land in the middle of the ocean. High, black cliffs rose out of the water. On the highest point of the island stood a tall, white lighthouse. It looked like a giant tooth. There was no light in the tower. Below the lighthouse, Sarah saw the house. It was a large building made of grey stone. It had many windows, but they all looked dark and empty. "It looks very lonely," David said. He stopped taking pictures and looked at the island. "Are you sure we are the only people there, Mark?" "Yes," Mark answered. "My family has owned this house for many years. No one lives there now. It is the perfect place for a quiet weekend." Sarah looked at the empty space on the bench next to David. "I still feel bad about Victor," she said. "He was so excited about this trip. Why did he miss the boat?" The group became silent. They had waited at the harbor for an hour, but Victor never arrived. He did not answer his phone. Finally, Mark decided they must leave because the storm was coming. Maybe he had work to do, Mark said, but he did not look at Sarah. "Victor is often late. Perhaps he will find a private boat and join us tomorrow." Sarah did not think that was true. Victor was a very punctual person. He never missed a plan. As a former journalist, Sarah had a sharp mind for details. She felt a small knot of worry in her stomach. The boat captain, a silent man with a red face, steered the boat toward a small wooden dock at the bottom of the cliff. The wood of the dock was old and green with sea plants. The boat hit the dock. "We are here," the captain said. He spoke for the first time. "I will come back on Monday morning. I hope the storm is not too bad for you." Sarah grabbed her suitcase and stepped onto the wet wood. She looked up at the grey house on the cliff. The wind began to blow harder, making a long whistling sound through the rocks. They were far away from the world now. The group walked up the narrow stone path. The path was steep and slippery because of the rain. Sarah carried her heavy suitcase, and her arms felt very tired. Above them, the old house looked even larger than it did from the sea. It was a cold, tall building with high walls and many dark windows. The stone was a dull grey color that matched the stormy sky. Mark reached the front door first. The door was made of thick, dark wood with a heavy iron handle. Mark pulled a large, old key from his pocket. He put the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened slowly. "Welcome to the family house," Mark said. He stepped inside and held the door open for the others. Sarah entered the hallway. The air inside the house felt very old and heavy. It smelled like dust and damp paper. It was very cold. almost colder than the air outside. There were no lights on yet. Everything was grey and dark in the shadows. Clara walked in and hugged her arms. She was still shivering. "It is so cold in here," she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the big hallway. "Can we start a fire?" "I will try to start the generator first," Mark replied. "Then we can have lights and some heat. Stay here for a moment." He walked toward a small door at the end of the hall. Sarah looked around the room. The furniture was covered with large, white pieces of cloth to protect it from dust. In the shadows, these shapes looked like silent ghosts. A big wooden clock stood in the corner, but it was not moving. The house was very quiet. The only sound was the wind hitting the glass of the high windows. David put his camera on a dusty table. "This place is interesting," he said. He looked at the high ceiling and the old paintings on the walls. "It is very different from the city. It has a lot of character." Sarah walked to a window at the side of the room. From here, she could see the ocean. The waves were getting much bigger now. The white foam of the sea looked like teeth against the black rocks. She felt very far away from her home and the busy streets of the city. Suddenly, the lights on the ceiling flickered and turned on. The yellow light was weak, but it helped. Sarah could see the dust floating in the air. Mark came back into the hallway. He looked tired. "The power is on now," he said. "The house is old, so we must be careful with the electricity. Let's take our bags to the bedrooms on the second floor." Sarah looked at the dark wooden stairs. They looked old. She followed the others up the stairs. Each step she took made a sharp, snapping sound under her feet. The house felt like it was waking up, but Sarah did not feel welcome. Sarah found her bedroom at the end of the long, dark hallway. The room was small and very cold. There was a thin bed with a blue blanket and a heavy wooden wardrobe. She placed her suitcase on the floor and walked to the window. The glass was cold against her fingertips. Outside, the sky was now a dark purple color, and the rain was hitting the roof with a steady rhythm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her mobile phone. She wanted to check for a message from Victor. She looked at the screen, but there was no signal. A small X appeared at the top of the screen. She moved the phone near the window, then near the door, but nothing changed. The island was too far away from the city. "Any luck?" a voice asked. Sarah turned around. David was standing in the doorway. He looked tired and worried. He was holding his own phone in his hand. "No signal," Sarah said. "I wanted to call Victor. It is not like him to disappear. He was the one who suggested this trip. He talked about it for weeks." David nodded. "I know. He wanted to see the old library in this house. He said this place had many secrets. It is very strange that he is not here." They went back downstairs to the kitchen. The kitchen was a large room with a stone floor and a very old stove. Clara was standing near the table. She was making hot tea, but her hands were shaking. The sound of the metal spoon hitting the ceramic cups was the only noise in the room. Mark was sitting at the wooden table. He was reading an old book. He looked very relaxed, which surprised Sarah. "Mark, we are worried," Sarah said as she sat down. "Victor never arrived at the dock. Now we have no phone signal. We are stuck here because of the storm. Don't you think this is a problem?" Mark closed his book slowly. He looked at Sarah with his calm, blue eyes. "Victor is an adult, Sarah. He is 40 years old. Perhaps he changed his mind. Perhaps he stayed in the city to work on his book. We cannot go back now because the boat is gone and the waves are too dangerous." "But he had the maps of the island," Clara said. Her voice was thin. "He said he found some old maps in the city archives. He wanted to show us something. Mark shrugged his shoulders. Maps or no maps, we are here to relax. We have food, we have light, and we have a roof. Let's not let Victor's absence ruin the weekend. Sarah looked at her tea. The steam rose up in thin, white lines. She did not feel relaxed. She felt that Mark was hiding something. Why was he so calm? She looked at the kitchen door. It led to the dark cellar. She felt a cold shiver go down her back. They were 4 adults in a big house, but the empty chair at the table made the room feel very lonely. Sarah left the kitchen and walked back up the stairs. She wanted to be alone for a few minutes. The conversation with Mark made her feel very uncomfortable. He was too calm, and she did not like that. The hallway on the second floor was very long and narrow. There was only one small light on the wall, and it did not reach the end of the hall. Her shadow looked very long and thin on the floor as she moved. She reached her bedroom door. She remembered closing it earlier, but now it was open a few inches. She stopped and listened. There was no sound inside the room. She pushed the door open and walked in. Everything looked the same as before. Her suitcase was on the floor. The blue blanket was still on the bed. Then, she saw something new. There was a small, white piece of paper on her pillow. It was folded in half. Sarah felt a sudden chill. She knew she did not put that paper there. She walked slowly to the bed and picked it up. Her fingers were shaking a little bit. She unfolded the paper. Inside, there was a message. The words were not written by hand. They were made from letters cut out of a magazine or a book. Each letter was a different size and color. The message was short and very clear. You should not be here. Leave now. Sarah read the words again and again. Her heart began to beat very fast against her ribs. Who put this here? Mark was in the kitchen. Clara was with him. David was in the living room with his camera. Or was he? She did not know where David was for the last 20 minutes. She walked to the window and checked the lock. It was closed tight. The person who left the note came through the door. This meant the person was already inside the house. It was either one of her friends, or someone else was hiding in the dark corners of the manor. She looked at the paper carefully. It was very clean and white. There was no name and no date. Just the warning. She felt a deep sense of danger. The island was small, and the house was isolated. There was no way to leave. The boat was gone, and the storm was very strong now. The wind hit the walls of the house with a loud, angry force. Sarah put the note in her pocket. She decided not to tell the others yet. She needed to observe them first. She needed to see who was acting strange or nervous. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the door. She did not want to sleep. She felt like someone was watching her from the shadows. The house was full of secrets, and now, she was part of one. She looked at the heavy wardrobe. Was someone inside? She looked under the bed. There was nothing but dust. But the feeling of fear stayed with her. She was not alone on Raven Island, and someone wanted her to go. Sarah walked down the stairs slowly. She kept her hand on the wooden rail. Her heart was still beating fast because of the note in her pocket. When she reached the living room, she saw the others. A fire was burning in the large stone fireplace, but the room still felt cold. The yellow flames danced and created long, moving shadows on the walls. The storm is here, David said. He was standing by the large window. The weather had changed quickly. Outside, the sky was completely black. The wind was so strong that the old house seemed to vibrate. Sarah heard the heavy rain hitting the roof like thousands of small stones. It was a loud, constant noise that made it difficult to talk. The boat captain was right, Clara said. She was sitting close to the fire with a blanket around her shoulders. He said the storm would be bad. I hope the dock is strong enough. Mark was standing near the fireplace. He was staring at the flames. This house has stood on this cliff for 100 years. He said. The walls are thick stone. We are safe inside. But Sarah did not feel safe. She looked at the window. A flash of lightning lit up the sky for a second. In that brief moment, she saw the white waves crashing against the rocks below. The sea looked like a hungry animal. Then, a loud sound of thunder shook the floor under her feet. It was not a sharp sound, but a deep, heavy roll that lasted for several seconds. Suddenly, the wind made a long, high whistling sound as it pushed through the gaps in the window frames. The curtains moved back and forth. I should check the kitchen windows, Mark said. He walked out of the room. Sarah watched him go. She wanted to tell David and Clara about the note, but she was afraid. What if one of them wrote it? She looked at David. He was looking at his camera, but he wasn't taking pictures. He looked nervous. Then she looked at Clara. Clara was staring at the door where Mark had left. Do you hear that? Clara asked suddenly. They all became very quiet. Under the sound of the rain and the wind, there was a different noise. It was a rhythmic hitting sound. It was coming from somewhere above them. It is probably just a loose shutter, David said, but he did not sound sure. I will go check, Sarah said. She wanted an excuse to look around the house again. As she walked toward the hallway, the lights overhead began to flicker. They turned bright, then dim, then bright again. The generator was struggling. Sarah stopped and waited. The house felt like it was breathing. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and the cold scent of the storm. She looked up at the ceiling. The hitting sound stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the angry roar of the ocean outside. Sarah went to the small room behind the stairs. Mark had told her earlier that the radio was kept there. It was their only way to talk to the mainland and ask for help. The room was very small and had a low ceiling. It was full of old books, dusty papers, and a few broken chairs. Sarah found the radio on a small wooden desk near the window. It was a large, black box with many buttons and a long antenna. She turned the knob to the right. She expected to hear a low humming sound or the static of a radio frequency. But there was nothing. The radio was completely silent. She tried again, turning the dial slowly from left to right. Still, there was no sound at all. The little green light on the front of the machine did not turn on. Sarah felt a cold feeling in her chest. She moved the radio to look at the back. She had to use the small torch on her phone to see in the dark corner. The power cord was hanging loosely. She picked it up and held it near the light. The end of the wire was not pulled out of the wall by accident. It was cut. The cut was very clean and straight. It was clearly made with a sharp knife or a sharp pair of scissors. This was not an accident. The storm did not do this. The wind could not reach this part of the house. Someone inside the house did not want them to talk to the outside world. Someone wanted them to stay isolated on Raven Island. She heard a footstep in the hallway. She turned her light toward the door. It was David. He looked pale in the flickering light of the torch. He was holding a glass of water. Did you find it? He asked. His voice was a bit shaky. The radio is broken, David, Sarah said. Her voice was firm, but her heart was racing. Look at the wires. Look closely. David walked closer and looked at the cut cord. He touched the edge of the wire with his finger. This is very bad, he whispered. This means we are truly alone. We cannot call the police. We cannot call the boat captain. Who would do this? Sarah asked. She looked at David's hands. They were empty, but he was wearing a heavy jacket with large pockets. I don't know, David said. He looked around the small, dusty room as if someone were hiding in the shadows. But we need to tell Mark and Clara. We cannot keep this a secret. We need to stay together in the living room. They walked back to the living room together. The fire was lower now, and the shadows on the walls were longer and more frightening. Clara was still sitting by the fireplace, wrapped in her blanket. Mark was standing by the window again, looking out at the dark sea and the white rain. The radio is useless, Sarah said loudly as she entered the room. Someone cut the wires with a knife. Clara gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes went wide with terror. Mark turned around slowly. He did not look surprised. He looked tired and sad. "Are you sure, Sarah?" Mark asked. He walked toward them. "I am a journalist, Mark." Sarah replied. "I have seen many things. I know the difference between a break and a cut. Someone used a tool. We are trapped here, and someone planned this." The room became very silent. The only sound was the heavy rain hitting the glass and the occasional crackling of the wood in the fire. No one spoke for a long time. They all looked at each other, and for the first time, Sarah saw true fear in their eyes. They were not just friends on a holiday anymore. They were suspects, and the island was their prison. The air in the living room was very heavy. No one wanted to look at each other. The discovery of the cut radio wires changed everything. They were not just waiting for the storm to end. They were waiting for something else. Sarah felt a cold sweat on her neck. She looked at the fire. It was dying, and the room was getting darker. "We need more candles," Sarah said. Her voice broke the silence. "The generator is not strong. If the lights go out completely, we will be in total darkness." Mark nodded slowly. He looked very tired. "There are boxes of candles and some old lanterns in the cellar. I can go and get them." "No," Sarah said quickly. She did not want Mark to go alone. She did not trust him. "I will go. I saw the cellar door in the kitchen earlier. I have a torch on my phone. I will come with you," David offered. He stood up, but Sarah shook her head. "Stay here with Clara," Sarah said. "She is very upset. I will be fast." Sarah walked into the kitchen. The stone floor felt like ice through her shoes. She opened the heavy wooden door that led to the cellar. A blast of cold, damp air hit her face. It smelled like wet earth and old metal. She turned on her phone's light and began to walk down the narrow stone steps. The stairs were uneven and slippery. Each step she took made a soft, dull sound against the stone. The cellar was a large, open space with a very low ceiling. There were many wooden shelves filled with glass jars and old tools. Large spider webs hung from the corners. Sarah moved her light around the room. She found the box of candles on a high shelf near the stairs. She put a few candles in her pocket. Then, her light hit something in the far corner of the room. It was not a box or a tool. It was a large, black suitcase. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She walked toward the corner. Her breath was coming in short, quick gasps. She recognized that suitcase. It was made of expensive leather, and it had a specific red ribbon tied to the handle. It belonged to Victor. She knelt down on the cold floor and looked at the name tag. It said Victor Vance. "How?" Sarah whispered to herself. The suitcase was dry. It was not wet from the rain or the sea. This meant the suitcase was inside the house before the storm started. But how was that possible? They all waited at the harbor for Victor. The captain said he never arrived. If the boat never brought him, how did his luggage get into the cellar of this house? She opened the suitcase. Inside, the clothes were neatly folded. There was a book about island history and a small leather bag with a lock. Victor was definitely here, or at least his things were. Sarah looked around the dark cellar. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of her eyes. Was Victor hiding in the house? Or did something happen to him before the others arrived? She heard a floorboard creak directly above her head. Someone was standing in the kitchen, right above the cellar door. Sarah turned off her phone light and stayed very still in the darkness. She held her breath and waited. Sarah stayed quiet in the dark cellar. The person above moved away from the door. Sarah waited for a few seconds. Then, she turned her light back on. She grabbed the candles and climbed the stairs. When she reached the kitchen, Mark was standing by the window. He was looking at the rain. "You were down there a long time," Mark said. He did not turn around. "I found Victor's suitcase." "Mark," Sarah said. She watched his back carefully. "It is in the cellar. It is dry. Why is his luggage here if he never arrived?" Mark turned around slowly. His face was very still. "The captain brought it yesterday," he said. "Victor sent his bags early. I forgot to tell you." Sarah did not believe him. The captain at the harbor said he had not seen Victor at all. Why would Mark lie about a suitcase? They walked back to the main hallway. As they passed a small corridor, Sarah noticed a door she did not see before. It was at the very end of the hall. The door was made of dark, heavy metal. It had no handle, only a large, old keyhole. It looked very different from the other wooden doors in the house. "What is in that room?" Sarah asked. She pointed at the metal door. Mark stopped walking. His body became very stiff. "That is my grandfather's private study," he said. His voice was cold and hard. "It has been locked for 20 years. No one goes in there. It is full of old, dangerous things. But we are looking for Victor," Sarah said. "Maybe he found a way inside. We should check every room in the house." "No," Mark said. He stepped in front of the door. He was much taller than Sarah, and he looked very angry now. "The room is locked. I do not have the key. It stays closed. Do not ask about it again. Sarah, it is for your own safety." Sarah looked at the metal door. It looked very strong. Why was Mark so protective of an old study? She felt that the answer to Victor's disappearance was behind that door. She also wondered why Mark was suddenly talking about safety. They went back to the living room. Clara and David were sitting by the fire. The room was very dark now because the generator was getting weaker. The yellow light from the candles made their faces look like pale masks. Sarah sat down, but she kept thinking about the metal door and the dry suitcase. "We should try to sleep," David said. He looked at his watch. "It is very late. Maybe the storm will stop in the morning." "I don't think I can sleep," Clara whispered. She looked at the dark corners of the room. Sarah agreed. She felt like the house was full of eyes. Every shadow seemed to move. She reached into her pocket and felt the note. "You should not be here. Leave now." She looked at Mark. He was staring at the fire again. Was he the one who wrote it? Or was there someone else behind the locked metal door? The group decided to go to their rooms. No one felt safe, but they were all very tired. Sarah entered her small bedroom and locked the door immediately. She pushed a heavy wooden chair in front of the door. She knew a lock was not enough to make her feel safe. She did not want to lie on the bed. Instead, she sat on the floor near the window and wrapped her coat around her shoulders. Outside, the world was a chaos of wind and water. The rain did not stop. It hit the glass window with a constant, rhythmic force. Every few minutes, a flash of lightning turned the dark sky into a bright, white screen. During those seconds, Sarah could see the sharp rocks and the angry ocean. She looked toward the lighthouse. It stood on the edge of the cliff, about 100 meters from the house. Mark said it was abandoned and empty. It had no electricity and no lighthouse keeper. It was just a hollow tower of stone. Sarah watched the tower. She waited for the next flash of lightning. When the sky turned white again, she saw the tower clearly. But this time, she saw something else. In the small window at the very top of the lighthouse, there was a tiny, yellow glow. She froze. She waited for the darkness to return, and then she waited for another flash. The light was still there. It was not a steady light like a lamp. It was flickering and moving, like a candle or a small torch. Someone was inside the lighthouse. "Is that Victor?" She whispered to herself. She remembered the dry suitcase in the cellar. If Victor was on the island, why was he hiding in a cold, stone tower during a storm? Or was it Elias, the man Mark had not mentioned yet? Sarah felt a mix of hope and deep fear. If Victor was alive, why didn't he come to the house? She watched the light for a long time. It moved from the left side of the window to the right side. Then, it suddenly went out. The tower became a dark shadow against the black sky again. Sarah rubbed her eyes. Was she seeing things because she was tired? No. She was a journalist. She was trained to see details. There was definitely a person in that tower. She looked at the door of her room. She wanted to run to David's room and tell him. But she stopped. She remembered the note on her pillow. "You should not be here." She remembered the cut radio wires. She did not know who to trust. If she told the others, the person in the tower might be in danger. She decided to wait until morning. She would find a way to reach the lighthouse herself. She sat back against the wall and watched the dark window. The wind made a low, mourning sound as it moved through the old stone of the house. Sarah did not sleep. She stayed awake, watching the tower and waiting for the sun to rise. The morning arrived, but there was no sun. The sky was a heavy, flat gray. The rain was not as loud as before, but a cold mist covered the island. Sarah's body felt stiff from sitting on the floor all night. She moved the chair away from her door and walked downstairs. Her head ached from lack of sleep. In the kitchen, David and Clara were sitting at the table. A single candle burned in the center. Mark was standing by the stove, heating a pot of water. No one was talking. The only sound was the low whistle of the wind through the kitchen door. Sarah did not sit down. She felt the paper in her pocket. She looked at her friends. They looked tired and old in the weak morning light. Clara's eyes were red from crying. David was staring at his empty hands. Mark looked as hard as the stone walls of the house. "I have something to show you," Sarah said. Her voice was loud in the quiet room. She took the note out and placed it on the wooden table. The small, cut-out letters looked dark and mean against the white paper. David leaned forward to read it. Clara gasped when she saw the words. "Where did you find this?" David asked. He looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "It was on my pillow last night," Sarah replied. She looked directly at Mark. "Someone in this house put it there. Someone wants me to leave. But we cannot leave because the boat is gone and the radio is broken." "I did not write that," Clara said quickly. Her voice was shaking. "I was in my room all night. I locked my door. I was too scared to move. And I was in the living room for a long time," David said. "Then I went to my bedroom. I didn't go into your room. Sarah, I promise." They all turned to look at Mark. He was still standing by the stove. He did not look at the note. He did not even move. "Mark," Sarah asked, "what do you know about this?" Mark turned around slowly. He looked angry. "This is my house," he said. "Why would I write a note telling people to leave?" That makes no sense. Maybe you wrote it yourself. Sarah. Maybe you want to create a drama because you are bored. That is a lie. Sarah shouted. She felt a hot wave of anger. And what about Victor's suitcase in the cellar? What about the light I saw in the lighthouse last night? You are hiding things. Mark. You are lying to us about your family and this island. The room became very tense. David stood up and moved away from the table. He looked at Mark, then at Sarah. He did not know who to believe. The friendship they had in the city was disappearing. Now, they were just 4 people trapped together. And they were all afraid. We are staying in this room together. Sarah said firmly. No one goes anywhere alone. We need to find out the truth about Victor and that locked metal door. Mark laughed. But it was not a happy sound. It was a cold, sharp noise. You can stay here if you want. He said. But I have work to do. This is my house, and I will go where I want. He walked out of the kitchen, and the heavy door closed. Sarah, David, and Clara stood in the silence, listening to his footsteps walk away into the shadows of the manor. Sarah looked at David and Clara. They were talking in low voices near the fire. They looked very tired and afraid. Sarah did not want to stay in the kitchen anymore. She felt like the walls of the house were closing in on her. She needed to see the island for herself. She wanted to know what Mark was hiding and where that light in the tower came from. She walked out of the back door quietly. She did not tell the others where she was going. The cold air hit her face like a physical blow. It felt better than the heavy, dusty air inside the house. The mist was very thick now. It was a pale, wet gray that covered everything. She could only see a few meters in front of her. She walked away from the house. She did not follow the main path that led to the dock. Instead, she walked toward the tall cliffs on the west side of the island. The grass was long and very wet. It soaked her boots and the bottom of her trousers. The wind was a constant, low whistle in her ears. Behind a group of large, black rocks, she saw something interesting. It was a narrow opening between 2 thick bushes. She pushed the wet branches away and found a small, hidden path. It led down the side of the cliff toward the sea. The path was made of uneven stones. It looked very old and dangerous. Sarah began to go down the path. She moved very slowly. She kept one hand on the cold stone of the cliff for balance. One wrong step could lead to a fall into the dark ocean below. The sound of the water became much louder as she got closer to the shore. A deep, roaring sound filled the air as the large waves hit the base of the island. Finally, she reached the bottom. She was standing on a small, private beach. The sand was dark and full of small, smooth stones. High cliffs surrounded the beach on 3 sides. It was like a secret room made of rock. The grey house was far above her now, hidden by the mist. Sarah looked at the ground. Because of the rain, the sand was soft and muddy. She saw something that made her stop. There were footprints in the sand. They were large footprints, clearly made by an adult. They led from the water toward a small cave in the side of the cliff. She looked around. The beach was very quiet, except for the heavy sound of the waves. She felt a sudden chill that was not from the wind. She felt like someone was watching her from the dark shadows of the rocks. She was alone on the shore, far away from her friends, and the mist was getting thicker every minute. Sarah stood very still on the dark sand. The mist moved around her like a slow, grey ghost. She looked at the footprints again. They were deep and fresh. The rain was washing them away slowly, but she could still see the shape of a heavy boot. She followed the trail with her eyes. The prints led toward a tall, flat rock near the water's edge. Suddenly, the mist opened for a few seconds. Sarah saw a person. It was a man. He was standing with his back to her, looking out at the angry sea. He was very tall and wore a long, dark raincoat that reached his knees. The hood of the coat covered his head, so she could not see his hair or his face. Sarah's heart felt like it was jumping in her chest. This was not Mark. Mark was back at the house, and he was not wearing a raincoat like that. This was not David either. David was much shorter. This was someone she did not know. The man did not move. He stood as still as a statue. The large waves crashed against the rocks near his feet, sending white spray into the air. The sound of the water was like a constant, heavy roar. Sarah wanted to turn around and run back up the hidden path. She wanted to be back in the kitchen with David and Clara. But she was a journalist, and her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She took a small step forward. A stone moved under her boot and made a sharp clicking sound. The man turned around immediately. Sarah stopped. She held her breath. The man pushed his hood back. He had a thick, grey beard and dark, deep eyes that looked very tired. His face was covered in small lines, like a map of a long life. He did not look angry, but he looked very surprised to see her. "You should not be down here," the man said. His voice was low and rough, like the sound of stones rubbing together. Sarah felt the cold rain on her face. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was small against the noise of the ocean. "Do you live here?" The man looked up at the cliff, toward the grey stone house. He did not answer her question immediately. He stepped away from the water and moved closer to Sarah. He walked with a slight limp in his left leg. "The storm is getting worse," he said. He pointed toward the horizon where the clouds were a deep, bruised purple. "The sea is hungry today. This beach is dangerous when the tide comes in. You need to go back up to the house." "Wait," Sarah said. "Did you write a note? Did you put a letter on my pillow?" The man looked at her for a long time. His eyes were very sad. "I do not write letters," he said. "I only watch. And I see that you are in a lot of trouble." "Sarah." Sarah froze. "How do you know my name?" The man did not answer. He turned and walked toward the small cave in the cliff. He moved quickly for a man with a limp. Before Sarah could move, he disappeared into the dark shadows of the rock. The mist closed again, and the beach was empty once more. Sarah ran toward the cave. The sand was wet and heavy, making it difficult to move quickly. "Wait!" she cried out. Her voice was lost in the roar of the wind. But the man stopped. She reached the entrance of the cave. It was dark and smelled like old seaweed and cold stone. The man was sitting on a large, flat rock. He was not hiding. He looked like he was waiting for her. "My name is Elias," the man said before she could speak. He did not look at her. He was looking at a small, sharp knife in his hand. He was using it to cut a piece of wood. "How do you know who I am?" "Elias," Sarah asked. She stayed near the entrance. She did not want to go too far into the darkness of the cave. "I hear things," Elias replied. He finally looked up. His eyes were sharp and very bright. "The wind carries voices on this island, and I have seen your friend, the tall one, Mark." Sarah felt a pulse of fear. "Mark? Does he know you are here?" Elias laughed quietly. It was a dry sound. "Mark knows many things. I live in a small cabin on the north side of the island. It is a very small place, hidden in the trees. I have lived there for a long time. I like the silence. But this weekend, the island is not silent." "Did you see our friend Victor?" Sarah asked. She moved a little closer. She felt a spark of hope. "He is a man with glasses. He has a leather suitcase. He was supposed to be with us, but he disappeared." Elias stayed silent for a long time. He rubbed his rough hands together to stay warm. I see many things, but I do not always speak about them. You should go back to the house. Sarah. But you must be careful. That house on the cliff. It has many secrets. Mark's family is not what you think. Sarah felt a cold shiver go down her back. What do you mean? Mark said his family owned the house for 100 years. The old house was built on lies. Elias said. His voice became very low. Many years ago, bad things happened there. Now, the past is coming back. You were a journalist. You look for the truth. But sometimes, the truth is a dangerous thing to find. Elias stood up. He looked much taller and stronger in the small cave. The tide is coming in now. The water will cover this beach soon. The path will be underwater. You must go now, or you will be trapped down here. Sarah wanted to ask more questions. She had 1,000 questions in her mind. But the cold water of the ocean was already touching her boots. The sea was moving closer to the cliff. She looked at Elias one last time, but he moved further into the darkness of the cave. He was gone. She turned and ran back toward the hidden path. She climbed the stone steps as fast as she could. Her heart was full of new worries. Who was this man? Why did he live alone on a rock in the sea? And what did he know about Mark's family? The grey shape of the house appeared through the mist above her. It did not look like a holiday home. It looked like a trap. Sarah reached the top of the cliff. She was breathing hard, and her lungs felt cold. The rain was still falling, but it was lighter now. She walked toward the back door of the house. She did not want to see Mark. She felt that every word he spoke was a lie. She entered the kitchen quietly. The room was empty. The fire in the living room was just a small glow now. She walked into the hallway. She remembered something she saw earlier that morning. When Mark was talking to them, he kept his hand near a small wooden box on a side table. Sarah walked to the table. The box was small and dark. She opened it slowly. Inside, there was a heavy, silver key. It looked very old. It was not a normal house key. It was long and had a strange shape at the end. This must be for the metal door. Sarah whispered. She took the key and put it in her pocket. She looked around the corner. She heard voices in the living room. David and Clara were talking about the boat. They sounded very worried. Mark was not with them. This was her chance. Sarah walked quickly to the end of the hallway where the dark metal door stood. The air near the door felt even colder than the rest of the house. She pulled the silver key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the large keyhole. It was covered in dust. She put the key into the hole. It fit perfectly. She felt a small spark of excitement. Finally, she would see what was inside the private study. She would find the truth about Victor. She gripped the end of the key and began to turn it to the right. The key moved a little bit. She heard a heavy, metallic click from inside the door. But then, the key stopped. It was stuck. Sarah tried to turn it harder. She used both hands. She pushed with all her strength. Suddenly, there was a sharp, dry sound. It was not a loud noise, but it felt very loud in the quiet hallway. Sarah felt the pressure in her hands disappear. She looked down. The top part of the key was in her hand, but the long part was still inside the lock. The key was broken. No. She whispered. She tried to pull the broken piece out with her fingers, but it was too deep. The lock was now blocked. The metal door was still closed, and now it was impossible to open it with a key. Sarah felt a wave of cold fear. If Mark saw the broken key, he would know she tried to enter his secret room. She heard a footstep behind her. It was a heavy, Slow step on the wooden floor. Sarah turned around quickly. She hid her hands behind her back. At the other end of the dark hallway, a tall shadow was standing. It was Mark. He was watching her, and his face was hidden in the darkness. Mark moved out of the shadows. His face was like a mask of stone. He did not say anything for a long time. He just looked at Sarah. Sarah's heart was beating very fast. She felt the broken piece of the key in her hand. It was cold and sharp. She kept her hands behind her back and prayed that he did not see the broken lock. The hallway is a dead end. Sarah. Mark said. His voice was very low. I told you not to come here. Why are you near my study? I got lost. Sarah said. It was a poor lie, and she knew it. The house is so big and dark. I was looking for the kitchen. Mark stepped closer. He was very tall, and he blocked the light from the other room. The kitchen is in the other direction. Do not wander again. It is time for lunch. The others are waiting. He turned around and walked away without waiting for her. Sarah waited until he was gone. She quickly put the broken piece of the key in her pocket. She felt sick. She knew Mark did not believe her. She walked to the dining room with heavy steps. In the dining room, a large bowl of vegetable soup sat in the middle of the table. Steam rose from the bowl, but the room was still freezing. David and Clara were already sitting down. They looked like they had been arguing. Mark sat at the head of the table. He began to put soup into the bowls. The metal spoon made a sharp clicking sound against the ceramic. The meal was very quiet. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind hitting the walls of the house and the sound of the rain on the roof. Sarah looked at the empty chair at the end of the table. It was the chair where Victor should be sitting. It felt like a dark hole in the room. Suddenly, a soft sound came from the side of the table. Clara was crying. She didn't make a loud noise, but the tears were running down her face. She put her spoon down and covered her eyes with her hands. I can't do this. Clara whispered. I can't sit here and eat soup while Victor is missing. Something terrible has happened to him. I know it. Clara, please. David said. He reached out to touch her arm, but she pulled away. No. Clara said. Her voice was louder now. We are all acting like everything is okay. But it is not. The radio is broken. The boat is gone. And Victor. Victor told me he was afraid of this trip. He said he found something in the old archives about this island. He said it was a dangerous place. Mark did not stop eating. He looked at his soup as if he were alone in the room. Victor was always dramatic. He said quietly, "He is our friend." Clara shouted. She stood up quickly. Her chair fell backward and hit the floor. She ran out of the room and up the stairs. They heard her bedroom door close with a heavy sound. The dining room became silent again. Sarah looked at Mark. He was still eating. He did not look sad. He did not look worried. He looked like a man who was waiting for something to happen. Sarah waited in the hallway until she heard Mark's footsteps return to the kitchen. David was still sitting in the living room, staring at the dying fire. This was her chance to move. She did not want to stay in her room and wait for something bad to happen. She needed a tool to remove the broken piece of the key from the metal door. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The stairs were very narrow and steep. At the very top of the house, there was a small wooden door. It was covered in thick layers of dust and spiderwebs. Sarah pushed the door open. It did not have a lock, but it was heavy. The attic was a large, low room under the roof of the manor. The air was very dry and smelled like old paper. Sarah turned on her phone's light. The light moved across the room, showing piles of broken furniture, old clothes in boxes, and tall stacks of newspapers. The rain hit the roof just above her head. She began to search through the boxes. She hoped to find a toolbox or a pair of pliers. She moved a heavy wooden chair and found a small chest made of dark wood. It was not locked. She opened the lid slowly. Inside the chest, there were no tools. Instead, there was a collection of old photographs. They were black and white, and the edges were yellow with age. Sarah picked them up and looked at them. They were pictures of Raven Island from many years ago. One photo showed the lighthouse. It looked new and clean in the picture. A man was standing in front of it, smiling at the camera. Another photo showed the house. There were people sitting on the grass in front of the stone walls. They looked happy. It was a beautiful summer day in the photo, very different from the dark, stormy day Sarah was experiencing. Sarah looked at a third photograph. This one was a group picture of 5 adults standing near the cliff. She moved her phone light closer to the image. Her heart began to beat faster. In the center of the photo, there was a tall man. He was wearing an old-fashioned suit. He had a very familiar face. He had the same sharp nose and the same cold, blue eyes as Mark. But the date written on the back of the photo was 50 years ago. This must be his father or his grandfather. Sarah whispered. But as she looked closer, she noticed something very strange. The man in the 50-year-old photo had a small scar on his left cheek. It was a thin, white line shaped like a half-moon. Sarah froze. She remembered seeing that exact same scar on Mark's face during lunch. How was that possible? Mark was not old enough to be in a photo from 50 years ago. She felt a wave of confusion and fear. She looked at the other people in the photo. She recognized the woman standing next to the man. It was Clara, or someone who looked exactly like her. Sarah heard a soft sound behind her. It was the sound of a shoe moving against the dusty floor. She turned her light toward the attic door. The door was now closed. Sarah stood perfectly still in the dark attic. She turned off the light on her phone. The room became black, except for the tiny gray light coming through the small holes in the roof. Her heart was beating so loudly that she thought the person behind the door could hear it. She waited. A second later, she heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps walking away from the door. The sound of feet on the old wood became quieter and quieter until it disappeared. She turned her light back on and looked at the photograph again. The date was very clear. 1976. The man in the picture was young, maybe 30 years old. He was wearing a dark suit. On his left cheek, there was a thin, white scar in the shape of a half-moon. This is impossible. She whispered. She knew Mark was around 35 years old now. If this photo was from 50 years ago, the man should be very old or dead. But the man in the photo was the exact same person she saw at lunch. He had the same eyes, the same hair, and that same specific scar. Then she looked at the woman in the photo again. The woman had long, dark hair and a small silver necklace. She looked exactly like Clara. Sarah felt a wave of cold fear. Was the island playing tricks on her? Or were her friends not who they said they were? She thought about Mark and Clara. She had known them for a few years in the city. But did she really know their history? Mark always talked about his family house, but he never showed her old pictures before. She carefully put the photograph into her inner coat pocket. She needed to keep this evidence. She also picked up a small, heavy metal tool she found near the chest. It was a long, thin piece of iron with a flat end. It was not a pair of pliers, but she thought she could use it to push the broken key out of the metal door. She walked to the attic door. She pushed it slowly. The door made a low, rubbing sound against the floor, but it opened. The hallway was empty. The weak yellow lights on the walls were flickering. Sarah walked down the stairs, trying to be as silent as possible. She felt like the house was a living thing, watching her every move. When she reached the second floor, she saw Mark standing at the end of the corridor. He was looking out of a window. He did not hear her at first. Sarah stopped and watched him. In the dim light, his profile looked exactly like the man in the 1976 photograph. He turned his head and saw her. "What were you doing in the attic, Sarah?" he asked. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "I was looking for a blanket," Sarah said. She tried to keep her voice steady. "It is very cold in my room." Mark walked toward her. As he got closer, Sarah looked at his cheek. The half-moon scar was there, white and clear. "There are no blankets in the attic," he said. "Only dust and memories. You should stay in the living room with the others. It is safer there." He walked past her, and for a moment, Sarah smelled something strange. It was the smell of old paper and salt, the same smell as the attic. She watched him go down the stairs. She was sure now. The man in the house and the man in the photo were the same, but she did not know how that could be true. Sarah hurried back to her bedroom. Her legs felt weak, and her hands were cold. She pushed the heavy chair in front of her door again. She needed to feel safe, even if it was only for a few minutes. She took the old photograph out of her pocket and looked at it one more time. The man with the half-moon scar stared back at her from the year 1976. It was a mystery that made her head hurt. She placed the photograph under her mattress. Then she reached into her other pocket and pulled out the thin metal tool. She planned to use it on the metal door later that night, when everyone was asleep. She felt like a spy in a house of ghosts. She turned toward her bed, ready to sit down and think. But she stopped suddenly. Her breath caught in her throat. There was a new piece of white paper resting on her blue pillow. "Not again," she whispered. She picked up the paper. It was just like the first one. The letters were cut out of a magazine and glued to the page. The message was short, but it sent a fresh wave of fear through her body. "Mark is lying to you." Sarah stared at the words. She already knew that Mark was lying. He lied about Victor's suitcase. He lied about the lighthouse. And the photograph proved he was lying about his very identity. But who was sending these notes? She thought about her friends. Was it David? He seemed nervous, but he spent most of his time looking at his camera. Was it Clara? She was crying and upset, but maybe that was an act. Or was it Elias, the man from the beach? He knew her name, and he seemed to know the secrets of the island. She walked to the window. The rain was falling steadily now. The wind made a long, low sound as it moved around the corners of the house. It sounded like a person crying in the distance. Sarah looked at the lighthouse again. It was a dark shape in the grey mist. If Mark is lying, who is telling the truth? She asked herself. She felt very alone. She wanted to talk to David, but she didn't know if she could trust him. If David was the one writing the notes, why was he doing it? Was he trying to help her, or was he trying to make her turn against Mark? Suddenly, there was a soft hitting sound against her bedroom door. It was not a loud knock. It was a gentle, rhythmic sound, like someone tapping their fingernails against the wood. Sarah froze. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The tapping stopped. Then, she heard a piece of paper sliding under the door. It moved across the floor and stopped near her boots. Sarah waited for a full minute. She listened for footsteps in the hallway, but she only heard the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. She knelt down and picked up the paper. This one was different. It was not a note with cut-out letters. It was a small piece of a map. It showed the cellar of the house, but there was a red X marked in a corner she had not explored yet. Sarah realized she could not wait until the morning. The truth was hidden somewhere in the dark parts of the house, and she had to find it before the person writing the notes found her. Sarah took the old photograph from her pocket. Her heart was beating fast. She could not wait anymore. She had to ask Mark the truth. She left her room and walked down the stairs. The house was very dark, and the yellow light from the candles was small and weak. She found Mark in the living room. He was sitting in a large leather chair. He was not reading or drinking tea. He was just staring at the wall. In the dim light, he looked like a statue made of stone. "Mark," Sarah said. Her voice was firm. Mark turned his head slowly. "Yes, Sarah. I thought you were sleeping. It is a long night." Sarah walked to the table and placed the black and white photo in front of him. "I found this in the attic. The date on the back says it is from 50 years ago." Mark looked at the photo. He did not look surprised. He did not move for a long time. Then, he picked up the photo with his long fingers. The firelight hit his face, and Sarah saw the half-moon scar on his cheek. It was exactly like the scar on the man in the picture. "This is my family history," Mark said. His voice was a low growl. "Why were you in the attic?" "I told you to stay in the common rooms. The attic is not for guests. The man in the photo has your scar, Mark," Sarah said. She stepped closer. She wanted him to see that she was not afraid. "And the woman looks exactly like Clara. How is that possible? No one stays the same for 50 years. Are you lying about who you are? Is this even your name?" Mark stood up quickly. The leather chair made a loud, rubbing sound against the floor. He was much taller than Sarah, and he looked very angry now. The calm mask on his face was gone. His eyes were dark and cold, like the sea outside. "You are a guest in my house, Sarah," Mark said. He spoke each word slowly. "But you are acting like an enemy. This is my private business. My family secrets stay in this house. You have no right to look at my photos or ask about my past." "Victor knew something, didn't he?" Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking, but she did not stop. "That is why he is missing. You did something to him because he found the truth in the archives. Is he behind that metal door?" Mark walked toward her. Sarah wanted to move back, but she stayed where she was. Mark stopped only a few centimeters away from her. She could smell the scent of old paper and cold rain on his clothes. "You are talking too much, Sarah," Mark whispered. "This is a dangerous island. The cliffs are high, and the sea is deep. Accidents happen very easily in the dark. If you want to see the mainland again, you must mind your own business. Go to your room and lock the door. Do not come out again tonight." Sarah felt a cold wave of fear, but she did not look away. She picked up the photo from the table and turned around. She walked out of the room, but she did not go upstairs. She felt the map of the cellar in her other pocket. Mark was dangerous, but she was more determined than ever. Sarah did not go back to her room. She could not rest now. Mark's words were a warning, but they also made her more curious. She felt the small piece of map in her pocket. It showed the cellar, but first, she wanted to visit the library. Victor had talked about the library many times before they left the city. He said it was the most important room in the house. The library was a small, circular room on the ground floor. The walls were covered with tall wooden shelves. Thousands of books sat in the shadows. The air was very thick with the smell of old paper and leather. There was a small fireplace in the corner, but no fire was burning there. The room was freezing. Sarah moved her phone light across the bookshelves. She was looking for anything that seemed strange. She remembered Victor's words. The best place to hide a secret is behind the history of the house. She walked to the fireplace. It was made of red bricks. Some of the bricks were cracked and old. Sarah began to touch the bricks one by one. She pushed them gently. Most of them were solid and did not move. But near the bottom, on the right side, she felt something different. One brick felt loose. She used the metal tool she found in the attic. She put the flat end into the gap around the brick and pulled. The brick made a dry, scraping sound against the stone. Slowly, it moved forward. Sarah pulled it out completely and placed it on the floor. Inside the hole, there was a small object wrapped in a piece of black cloth. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled it out. She unwrapped the cloth. It was a small, brown leather book. On the front cover, there were 2 letters written in gold. V. Victor Vance. Sarah whispered. This was Victor's journal. She opened the book. The pages were full of Victor's neat, small handwriting. He wrote about his research in the city archives. He wrote about the history of Raven Island. He wrote about a secret that the Mark family wanted to hide. Sarah turned the pages quickly. She looked for the last entry. Victor wrote, "I am at the house now. I arrived early to look at the cellar. Mark does not know I am here yet. I found the hidden door. I am afraid. If something happens to me, look at the map." Sarah turned to the very last page of the book. She stopped and stared. The page was gone. It was not just empty. It was torn out. The edge of the paper was jagged and sharp. Someone had removed the final part of the story. Who took it? She wondered. She looked at the small book in her hands. Victor was here. He was here before Sarah and the others arrived. He was investigating the house, and he found something in the cellar. But someone else found him, or at least found his journal. Sarah heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. She quickly wrapped the journal in the cloth and hid it in her coat. She put the brick back into the wall. She stood up and turned off her light just as the door to the library began to open. Sarah stood very still in the dark library. The door opened slowly, making a long, low sound of wood rubbing against the floor. A thin line of light entered the room. Sarah hid behind a large leather chair and pulled her legs close to her body. She did not move a muscle. She watched the light move across the shelves of old books. The person stayed near the fireplace for a minute. Sarah heard the soft sound of a hand touching the red bricks. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound. Then, the light moved away. The person walked out of the library and closed the door with a dull thud. Sarah waited for a full minute in the silence. Then she turned on the light on her phone. She felt the leather journal inside her coat. It was small and heavy. The last page is the most important part. She thought. Someone took it because it has the final secret. She left the library and walked into the hallway. She kept her eyes on the floor, looking for a small piece of paper. She went to the living room first. David was sitting on the sofa. He was looking at his camera, but he was not taking any pictures. "David," Sarah said. David jumped. His camera almost fell from his hands. "Oh, Sarah, you scared me. I did not hear you come in. Did you see anyone near the library?" she asked. She watched his face carefully. "No," David said. He looked down at his camera again. "I have been here for 20 minutes. Why are you asking? Is something wrong?" Sarah did not answer. She looked at David's black bag on the floor. It was open. She saw some white papers inside, but they looked like maps and camera instructions. She could not see a torn page. She went to the kitchen. Clara was sitting at the wooden table. She was staring at a single candle. The light made her face look very pale and thin. "Clara, are you okay?" Sarah asked softly. "I'm just thinking about Victor," Clara said. Her voice was weak. I want to go home. Sarah. I don't like this house. I don't like the way Mark looks at us. Sarah looked around the kitchen. She looked under the table and near the old stove. She did not see the missing page. She felt a deep suspicion growing in her mind. David was acting nervous, and Clara was very quiet. And Mark. Mark was full of anger. She went back to the hallway and walked up the stairs. She wanted to look in the bedrooms, even though she knew it was wrong. She went to David's room first because the door was open. She looked at his desk. There were many photos of the house and the lighthouse. She saw a small piece of paper under a heavy book. She pulled it out quickly, but it was only a receipt for a new lens. It was not the page from the journal. Where is it? She whispered. She felt the piece of the map in her pocket, the one that was pushed under her door. She realized that the person who took the page might be the same person who was trying to help her. Or perhaps the page was hidden in a place no one wanted to go. She looked out the window at the dark tower of the lighthouse. She decided she had to go there. Sarah did not wait for the morning. She knew the missing page was the key to everything. She went to the back door and pulled on her heavy boots. She grabbed a thick waterproof jacket and a small lantern from the kitchen shelf. She moved quietly so Mark would not hear her. She felt like a shadow moving through the dark house. She stepped outside. The wind was much colder now, and the rain felt like small needles against her skin. The sky was a deep, ink-black color. The only light came from the small lantern in her hand. It created a tiny circle of yellow light on the wet grass. She began to walk toward the lighthouse. The path was not clear. The long grass was wet and heavy, making every step difficult. She struggled against the wind. It was so strong that it pushed her back. But she did not stop. She kept her head down and moved forward slowly. The lighthouse stood on the very edge of the cliff. In the dark, it looked like a giant, silent ghost. As she got closer, she heard the waves hitting the rocks below. The sound was a constant, deep roar that shook the air. The mist was thick, and the salt from the sea made her eyes sting. I must be brave, she whispered to herself. She reached the base of the tower. The lighthouse was made of large, grey stones. The stones were covered in green moss and felt very cold and slimy to the touch. She walked around the circular base until she found a heavy iron door. The door was not locked. It was open a few inches, moving back and forth in the wind. Every time it moved, it made a long, high scraping sound against the stone floor. Sarah felt a cold shiver of fear. If the door was open, someone was definitely inside, or someone had been there very recently. She pushed the door open. It was very heavy and moved slowly. Inside, the air was different. It did not smell like the sea. It smelled like old oil and burnt wood. She held her lantern up high. The light showed a narrow, spiral staircase made of metal. The stairs went up into the darkness, turning around and around until they disappeared. Sarah stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The sound of the wind and the ocean became much quieter. Now, the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling. She looked at the first step of the metal stairs. There were wet footprints on the ground. They were fresh. She began to climb. Her boots made a sharp, metallic sound on each step. The sound echoed up the tall tower. She felt very small in the middle of the great stone cylinder. She kept one hand on the cold wall and the other on her lantern. She was moving toward the light she saw from her bedroom window, and she was moving toward the truth. The metal stairs seemed to go on forever. Sarah's legs felt very heavy, and her breath was coming in short, loud gasps. The air inside the tower was very thin and cold. Every time she took a step, the metal stairs made a loud, ringing sound that traveled up and down the stone walls. She stopped for a moment to rest. She looked down into the darkness. The floor was now very far away. I have to keep going, she whispered to herself. She continued her climb. Finally, she reached a small wooden platform. Above it was a square hole with a ladder. She climbed the ladder and pushed herself through the hole. She was now in a small, circular room just below the big glass lamp of the lighthouse. Sarah held up her lantern. She expected to see an empty, dusty room. But she was wrong. The room was not empty at all. In the corner, there was a small bed made of old blankets and a thin mattress. The blankets were not dusty. They looked clean and were folded neatly. Next to the bed, there was a wooden crate. On top of the crate sat a half-empty bottle of water and a small tin of beans with a silver fork inside. Sarah touched the tin. It was not cold. Someone had eaten from it very recently. Someone is living here, Sarah said. Her voice was full of surprise. She moved her light around the room. On the wall, there was a small mirror and a clean towel. This was not a place for a ghost. This was a home for a person. She saw a small pile of books on the floor. She picked one up. It was a book about the sea. Inside the cover, there was no name, but there was a small drawing of a bird, a raven. Sarah felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Was Victor living here? Or was it Elias, the man from the beach? She looked at the small bed again. It was too small for a tall man like Mark. It was the right size for Victor. She walked to the window. From here, she could see the grey house on the cliff. It looked small and lonely in the dark. The windows of the house were dark, except for one small light in the kitchen. She felt like she was watching a different world from up here. Then, she noticed something under the bed. It was a small piece of dark leather. She knelt down on the cold stone floor and reached for it. She pulled it out. It was a small bag, the kind used for carrying tools or pens. She opened it. Inside, she found a pair of glasses. She recognized them immediately. They were Victor's glasses. He could not see well without them. Why would he leave them here if he was hiding? Suddenly, Sarah heard a sound. It was not the wind or the rain. It was the sound of a heavy boot hitting the metal stairs far below. Someone was coming up the tower. They were moving fast, and they did not have a light. Sarah turned off her lantern quickly. The room became pitch black. She stayed very still on the floor, holding her breath and listening to the rhythmic ringing of the metal stairs. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone wall. She tried to make herself as small as possible in the deep shadows. The sound of the boots on the metal stairs grew louder and louder. Each step was heavy and slow. She could hear the person's breathing now. It was a deep, raspy sound that filled the small room. A tall shadow appeared at the top of the ladder. The man did not have a light, but the faint grey glow from the window showed his shape. He was very big. He stood in the center of the room and did not move for a long time. Sarah closed her eyes and prayed he would not hear her heart beating. The man walked to the small bed. He sat down. He stayed there for a minute. Then he stood up and walked to the window. He looked out toward the manor for a long time. Finally, he turned around and went back down the ladder. Sarah heard his boots hitting the metal stairs until the sound disappeared completely. She waited for 5 minutes before she moved. Her hands were shaking as she turned her lantern onto its lowest setting. She needed to leave, but first, she looked at the place where the man was sitting. Her light hit a small white object near the leg of the bed. It was a piece of paper. It was folded into a small square. Sarah picked it up. She recognized the paper immediately. The edges were jagged and sharp. It was the missing page from Victor's journal. She unfolded it carefully. The page was covered in Victor's small, neat handwriting. In the center of the page, there was a detailed drawing. It was a map of the cellar in the manor. But this map was different from the one she had in her pocket. The drawing showed a hidden area behind the wall of the wine cellar. There was an arrow pointing to a specific brick near the floor. Next to the arrow, Victor had written one word in large letters: trap door. Below the drawing, there was a final note. The family secret is not in the library. It is under the ground. Mark is not the owner. He is the guard. I found the documents, and now I am in danger. If you find this, go to the cellar. The truth is under the fourth stone. Sarah felt a cold wave of realization. Victor was not just missing. He was hiding because he found out that Mark did not actually own Raven Island. But if Mark was not the owner, who was? And what were the documents Victor mentioned? She put the page into her pocket with the rest of the journal. She knew she had to get back to the house. The storm was still strong, but she had the missing piece of the puzzle now. She climbed down the ladder and began the long walk down the spiral stairs. She moved quickly, her mind full of questions about the hidden room and the secret floor. The journey back from the lighthouse was a nightmare. The wind had become even more violent, screaming across the cliffs like a wounded animal. Sarah kept her head down, her lantern swinging wildly in her hand. Twice, she nearly lost her footing on the slippery grass, her heart stopping as she looked down at the dark void where the cliff met the sea. She reached the back door of the manor, her clothes soaked and her face stinging from the salt and rain. She entered the kitchen, shivering uncontrollably. The house was deathly quiet. Even the ticking of the old clock in the hallway seemed to have stopped. She didn't turn on any lights. She used only the dim glow of her lantern, which was now running low on oil. She walked straight to the cellar door. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to go to her room and hide under the blankets. But she knew this was her only chance. Mark, David, and Clara were presumably in their rooms. She opened the heavy wooden door. It groaned, a long, low sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Sarah froze, holding her breath, listening for any movement from the floors above. Nothing. She descended the stone steps into the damp, cold darkness of the cellar. The smell of wet earth was stronger here. She reached the bottom and moved toward the wine cellar area indicated on Victor's map. Her light flickered, the flame dancing as the oil neared its end. 1, 2, 3. She whispered, counting the large, square stones that made up the floor. She reached the fourth stone from the far wall. It looked exactly like the others, heavy, grey, and covered in a thin layer of grit. She knelt down, the cold of the floor seeping into her knees. She used the metal tool from the attic to scrape the dirt from the edge of the stone. She pushed the tool into the gap and leaned her weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, grating sound of rock against rock, the stone shifted. Sarah gripped the edge with her fingers and pulled with all her strength. The stone came up, revealing a dark, wooden handle underneath. It was a trapdoor, perfectly hidden beneath the floor. She pulled the handle, and the wooden door swung open on silent hinges. Below was a small, brick-lined compartment. Inside sat a metal box, rusted at the edges but still solid. Sarah reached in and pulled it out. Inside the box were several thick envelopes made of heavy yellow paper. She opened the first one. It was a legal document, dated only 5 years ago. She scanned the lines quickly, her eyes widening as she read the names. It was a deed of ownership for Raven Island. The owner was not Mark. It was not even Mark's family. The island belonged to a man named Marcus Thorne, the man from the beach. But there was more. She opened the second envelope and found a series of medical records and birth certificates. She looked at Mark's name. According to these papers, Mark was not 35 years old. He was born over 60 years ago. Suddenly, the cellar light, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickered and died. Sarah was plunged into total darkness. Then, from the top of the stairs, she heard the sound of the cellar door being locked from the outside. "Sarah!" A voice called out from the darkness above. It was Mark. I told you to stay in your room. Sarah sat in the absolute darkness of the cellar, her back pressed against the cold stone of the wine rack. She held the metal box tight against her chest. The documents inside felt like lead. Above her, the heavy wooden door was a solid barrier, and she could hear Mark's footsteps pacing slowly on the kitchen floor. You weren't supposed to find that, Sarah. Mark's voice came through the door. It sounded different, deeper, and stripped of all its friendly warmth. Victor was the same. He couldn't leave well enough alone. He had to dig. He had to know the history. What are you, Mark? Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the damp walls. The papers say you were born in 1960. That's impossible. And Elias, the man on the beach, he owns this place. There was a long silence. The wind outside roared, shaking the house, but the cellar remained deathly still. Elias is the rightful heir, Mark finally said. But he is weak. He doesn't understand what this island requires. My family has been the guards here for 3 generations. We keep the secrets. We keep the island hidden from people like you, journalists, investigators, the curious. Where is Victor? Sarah demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Victor is resting. Mark replied coldly. He found the documents. Just like you. He realized that my youth isn't a miracle. Sarah. It's a burden. This island has a way of preserving what it needs, provided the price is paid in solitude. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She realized then that Mark wasn't just a man protecting an inheritance. He was a man trapped in a role he had played for far too long. The preservation he spoke of sounded like a curse. She needed to move. She couldn't wait for him to come down. Her hand brushed against the tool she had used to pry up the stone. She remembered the map in the journal, the one with the word trapdoor. She had opened the small compartment, but the drawing had shown an arrow pointing deeper into the wall. She turned on her phone's light for a brief second, shielding the glow with her hand. She looked at the wall behind the 4th stone. There was a faint outline in the mortar, a vertical crack that looked out of place. I'm coming down now, Sarah, Mark said. She heard the heavy bolt of the door slide back. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the section of the wall where the crack was. To her shock, it didn't just move, it swung inward on a pivot. It wasn't stone at all, but a clever facade of wood and plaster. She scrambled through the opening just as the cellar door creaked open above. She pulled the fake wall shut behind her, plunging herself back into a narrow, earthy tunnel that smelled of salt and ancient dust. She was no longer in the cellar. She was inside the very foundation of the island. The tunnel was so narrow that Sarah had to crawl on her hands and knees. The ceiling was low, and the rough, cold earth scraped against her shoulders. She didn't dare turn on her phone's light for more than a second at a time. Every time she did, she saw the walls were reinforced with old, bleached driftwood that looked like white bones in the darkness. Behind her, she heard a muffled roar of anger. Mark had discovered the hidden passage. She heard the weight hitting the false wall, trying to force it open. Sarah, you don't know what you're doing. His voice echoed through the narrow space, distorted and haunting. The island won't let you leave with those papers. Sarah didn't answer. She pushed herself forward, her fingers digging into the damp sand. As she moved deeper, the smell of the cellar faded, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of the open sea. The air became colder, and she began to hear a rhythmic, heavy thumping sound, the waves hitting the cliffs. But from the inside, after what felt like an hour of crawling, the tunnel widened into a small, natural cavern. The floor was covered in smooth sea stones. In the center of the cavern, a small lantern sat on a crate, its flame flickering weakly. Victor, she whispered, her voice trembling. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. A man was sitting against the rock wall, his legs covered by a heavy wool blanket. He looked thin and pale, and his glasses were missing. Sarah remembered finding them in the lighthouse. "Sarah?" the man asked. His voice was a thin rasp. "Is that really you?" "Victor." "Oh, thank God." Sarah scrambled over the stones toward him. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. "You shouldn't have come back for me," Victor said, grabbing her hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Mark, he didn't kill me. He couldn't. He needs a witness. He needs someone to eventually take over the watch when he finally passes." "The documents, Victor," Sarah said, pulling the yellow envelopes from her coat. "I found them. Mark isn't who he says he is. He's been here since the 60s, hasn't he? He looks 30, but he's 80 or 90. Victor nodded weakly. "It's the island, Sarah. There's something in the stone, something in the water. It slows everything down. But it's a prison. Elias is the only one who escaped the preservation because he refused to stay in the house. He lives in the elements, and so he ages like a normal man." A sharp crack echoed from the tunnel behind them. The sound of wood splintering. Mark was through the pivot wall. "He's coming," Victor whispered, his eyes widening with terror. "Sarah, there's an exit at the back of this cave. It leads out to the Devil's Throat, the narrow bridge of rock that connects the lighthouse cliff to the main island. You have to take the documents to Elias. He's the only one who can sign them over to the authorities and end this." Sarah looked at the dark opening at the back of the cave. The roar of the ocean was deafening now. She looked back at the tunnel where the sound of Mark's crawling was getting closer. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You have to," Victor insisted, pushing her toward the exit. "If he catches you with those papers, they'll disappear forever, and we'll both be guards here until the stones turn to dust. Go. Now." Sarah didn't listen to Victor's pleas to leave him. She couldn't. She grabbed his arm, slinging it over her shoulder. He was lighter than he looked. His body felt thin, as if the island had been slowly draining the substance from his bones. Together, they stumbled toward the back of the cavern where a jagged crack in the rock revealed a vertical sliver of the storm-tossed night. They squeezed through the opening and were immediately blasted by the full fury of the Atlantic. They were standing on a narrow spine of black basalt that connected the main body of Raven Island to the isolated pillar of the lighthouse. To their left and right, there was nothing but a 300-foot drop into a churning cauldron of white foam and black water. The Devil's Throat. The wind here was a physical force, screaming through the narrow gap and threatening to pluck them off the ledge. Sarah gripped the cold, wet stone with her free hand, guiding Victor along the path. The rock bridge was barely a meter wide in some places, slick with salt spray and ancient moss. "Faster, Victor!" she cried, though her own voice was snatched away by the gale. Behind them, a silhouette emerged from the crevice. Mark had reached the exit. He didn't look like a man in his 30s anymore. In the flashes of lightning, his face seemed to shift, the skin tightening and loosening, his eyes glowing with an unnatural, frantic light. He wasn't running. He was moving with a terrifying, calculated grace, unaffected by the wind that made Sarah stumble. "You cannot take the truth from this island, Sarah," Mark shouted. His voice somehow cut through the storm, resonant and deep. "The documents belong to the house. They belong to the silence." Sarah reached the midpoint of the bridge. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose shale, and she fell to her knees, nearly pulling Victor over the edge. They teetered for a heartbeat above the abyss. Below, the waves hit the cliffs with the sound of 1,000 cannons. She looked back. Mark was only 10 paces away. He stopped, his long coat snapping in the wind like the wings of a giant crow. He held out a hand, not in a gesture of help, but of command. "Give me the box, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "Give it to me, and I will let you both live. You can stay here. You can stay young. You can see the centuries turn. Like you." Sarah spat, pulling herself up and dragging Victor another step toward the lighthouse side. "You're not young, Mark. You're a ghost in a living body. You're a prisoner of your own greed." She reached into her coat and pulled out the yellow envelope containing the deed. She held it out over the churning water. "One more step, and I drop it," she threatened. "If Elias doesn't get these papers, the legal chain is broken. The guardianship ends anyway because the state will seize the land once you can't prove who you are." Mark froze. For the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of genuine terror in his eyes. It wasn't the fear of death, but the fear of time. Without the documents to maintain the legal illusion of his identity, his sanctuary would be invaded. The world would come to Raven Island with its cameras, its doctors, and its clocks. Suddenly, a new figure appeared at the far end of the bridge, near the lighthouse base. It was Elias. He held a heavy iron harpoon, and his grey beard was soaked with rain. He looked at Sarah, then at the man chasing her. "It's over, Marcus," Elias called out. His voice was steady, the voice of the true owner. "The watch is finished. Let them pass." The wind seemed to scream louder at the sound of Elias's voice. Mark, or Marcus, as Elias had called him, stiffened. He looked across the bridge at the old man with the harpoon. In the flickering light of the storm, the two men looked like night and day, one frozen in a youthful mask of 1960s perfection, the other weathered and broken by the honest passage of years. "You," Marcus hissed. "You lived like a beggar in the dirt. Elias. You let yourself rot while I kept the foundation strong. I did this for the family name. There is no family left, Marcus," Elias said, his voice heavy with a deep, ancient sadness. "Just you, a prisoner of a stone house, and me, waiting for the sea to take what's left of my bones. Let the girl and the boy go. It's over." Marcus looked at Sarah. His eyes were wild. He was a man who had sacrificed his soul to stop the clock, and he couldn't understand why anyone would want to let it tick. He lunged forward, his hand clawing for the yellow envelope in Sarah's hand. "Sarah, look out!" Victor cried. Sarah stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the basalt spine. Small stones tumbled into the darkness below, silent long before they hit the water. She swung the metal box at Marcus, hitting him square in the chest. He gasped, more surprised than hurt, and stumbled. At that moment, a massive wave, a true giant of the Atlantic, hit the base of the devil's throat. The impact felt like an earthquake. The entire rock bridge shuddered. A crack, long and jagged, began to open right between Sarah and Marcus. "The bridge is giving way," Elias shouted. "Jump, Sarah. Now." Sarah grabbed Victor's belt and heaved him forward with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Victor landed on the stable side of the ledge near Elias. Sarah leaped after him just as the center of the rock spine groaned and collapsed into the abyss. A cloud of salt spray and dust filled the air. When it cleared, a 10-meter gap of churning water now separated the lighthouse cliff from the main island. Marcus stood on the far edge, his face pale as the moon. He was trapped on the side of the manor. He looked down at the gap, then at the documents still clutched in Sarah's hand. The guard was now locked in his own prison. He didn't scream. He didn't even move. He simply stared, a boy king with no kingdom left but a crumbling house of secrets. Elias helped Sarah and Victor up. His hands were rough as bark but surprisingly warm. "Come," he said, guiding them toward the heavy iron door of the lighthouse. "The storm will peak in an hour. We must get inside." As they entered the base of the tower, Sarah looked back across the gap. She saw the light in the manor kitchen flicker and die. Marcus was gone from the edge, presumably retreating into the shadows of the house that had claimed his life before it was even lived. Inside the lighthouse, it was quiet. The thick stone walls muffled the storm. Elias led them to a small wood-burning stove where a low fire was still crackling. "You have the deeds," Elias said, looking at the box. "And the medical records. You know what he is. What we are." "I know that you're the one who was sending the notes," Sarah said, shivering as she sat by the heat. "The magazine letters. The map. Why didn't you just tell us?" "Marcus was always watching," Elias replied, staring into the flames. "He has ears in the walls of that house. I had to be a ghost to save you." The small fire in the lighthouse stove crackled, casting long, orange shadows against the circular stone walls. Sarah sat wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Elias had provided. Beside her, Victor was sipping hot tea, his color slowly returning to his face, though he still looked haunted. The documents, the evidence of Marcus's long, stolen life, sat on the crate between them. "How did he do it, Elias?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "How can a man live 60 years and not age a day?" Elias sat on his small stool, his hands folded. "It's the island. There is a vein of dark stone deep beneath the manor, something old, something that magnetic fields and the sea have kept secret. My grandfather discovered it. He found that if you stay within the house, the cells of the body forget how to die, but they also forget how to live." He looked toward the window, where the storm was finally beginning to lose its fury. The wind had turned into a low, mournful moan. Marcus loved the power of it. Elias continued. "He loved being the young master of the house forever. But I saw what it did to our father. He became cold, like the stone itself. He stopped feeling love, or pity, or joy. I chose the cliffs. I chose to grow old and feel the pain of the wind because it meant I was still human." "And David and Clara?" Sarah asked suddenly. "They are still in the house." "They are safe," Elias assured her. "Marcus only cares about the secret. Now that the bridge is gone and the documents are in your hands, the secret is dead. He has no reason to hurt them. He is likely sitting in his study right now, watching the sun rise for the first time as a man who knows he can finally be defeated by time." As the first grey light of morning began to bleed through the salt-stained windows of the lighthouse, the ocean finally calmed. The white foam of the devil's throat settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. Sarah walked to the window. The manor across the gap looked different in the dawn. It no longer looked like a majestic estate. It looked like a ruin, a hollow shell of grey rock. She saw two figures standing on the lawn near the cliff's edge. David and Clara. They looked small and confused, but they were alive. They were looking toward the lighthouse, waving their arms. "We have to get off this island," Victor said, standing up on shaky legs. "The tide will be low in an hour." Elias said, "The boat captain will return to check on the dock. I will go with you. I have spent enough time as a ghost. It is time for the owner of Raven Island to close the house for good." Sarah looked at the yellow envelopes one last time. She thought about the journalist she had been when she arrived, looking for a simple story about an old house. Instead, she had found a man who had cheated death and lost his soul in the process. She felt the weight of the journal in her pocket. She would tell the story, not for the fame, but to make sure no one else ever came to Raven Island looking for the Fountain of Youth. Some secrets were meant to be buried at the bottom of the sea. The sun struggled to rise through the thick, grey curtain of the Atlantic mist. Inside the lighthouse, Sarah stood by the narrow window, watching the horizon. The ocean was calmer now, though the waves still hit the rocks with a rhythmic pulse. Elias was busy in the corner, tending to Victor, who had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. The metal box sat on the floor, its rusted edges catching the weak morning light. "He will come soon," Elias said, his voice echoing in the small room. "Captain Miller is a man of his word. He knows the storm was bad. He will come to see if the house still stands." Sarah turned away from the window. "But the bridge is gone. Elias, even if the boat arrives, how do we get Clara and David? They are trapped on the other side of the devil's throat. Marcus is there with them." Elias stood up, his joints stiff. He walked to the window and looked across the gap. The manor looked like a graveyard of grey stone. "There is another way. My father didn't just build a bridge. He was a man of the sea. He knew that nature is unpredictable. There is a cable system, hidden beneath the base of the lighthouse. It was used for moving supplies when the seas were too high for a boat to dock." "A cable?" Sarah asked. "Will it still work?" "It must be decades old. It is made of heavy iron and thick rope." Elias replied. "It is slow, and it is dangerous, but it is the only way to reach the main island without a bridge. We must move now, before Marcus realizes what we are doing. He thinks we are trapped here, but he has forgotten the old ways." Sarah looked at Victor. He was pale, but his breathing was steady. "We can't leave him here. He will be safe for now." Elias said, "The iron door of the lighthouse is strong. I will lock it from the outside. Once we have the others, we will signal the boat from the manor's dock." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. She reached for her lantern, but Elias shook his head. "No light. Not yet. We must be like the mist. If Marcus sees a light moving toward the house, he will be waiting at the anchor point. We need the element of surprise." They descended the spiral stairs in silence. At the base of the lighthouse, Elias pulled a heavy rug aside, revealing a rusted iron ring set into the floor. He pulled, and a small hatch opened. Below, a set of wooden rungs led into a damp, dark chamber. Sarah followed him down, her hands gripping the cold wood. In the small room below, a massive iron winch sat bolted to the rock. A thick, salted rope stretched out through a narrow hole in the cliff face, vanishing into the grey fog toward the manor. "It is a primitive cradle," Elias whispered. "One person at a time. I will go first to secure the line. You must follow when I signal by tugging the rope 3 times." The descent into the lower chambers of the lighthouse was like stepping back in time. The air was thick with the smell of brine and old grease. Elias moved with a practiced ease, despite his age. He checked the tension of the rope, his rough hands feeling for fraying or rot. Sarah watched him, her heart thumping. The cradle was nothing more than a wooden seat attached to a pulley. "It is a long drop," Elias warned. "Do not look down. Keep your eyes on the rope. If the wind picks up, the cradle will swing. You must hold the sides tight." Sarah watched as Elias climbed into the seat. He released a heavy iron brake, and he slid out into the mist. The rope hummed as it moved through the pulley. Sarah stood by the opening, watching the line disappear. The sound of the waves below was a constant, hungry roar. Seconds felt like hours. Then, the rope went slack. A moment later, she felt it. She took a deep breath, clutched the metal box to her chest, and climbed into the wooden seat. The wood felt damp and slippery. She released the brake. Suddenly, the floor was gone. She was suspended over the abyss. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the salt spray stung her eyes. She gripped the sides so hard her knuckles turned white. Below her, the The devil's throat was a churning mess of white foam. She felt the cradle swing as a gust of wind hit her. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying the rope would hold. The movement was slow, an agonizing slide through the grey nothingness. Then, her feet hit something solid. Elias's strong arms grabbed her, pulling her onto a small stone ledge. They were on the manor side of the cliff, tucked into a natural alcove below the garden. "We are here," he whispered. "But the climb is steep. We must go through the sea caves. They lead directly into the cellar, but not through the door you used. There is a drainage tunnel that comes out near the kitchen." "The kitchen," Sarah whispered back. "That's where I last saw Mark. He will be in his study," Elias said. "He spends the mornings there, watching the sea. He thinks he is the master of all he surveys. He won't expect us to come from below." They moved into the cave system. The walls here were wet, covered in a strange, glowing moss that provided a faint, green light. The tunnel was narrow and required them to walk in a crouch. Sarah felt the weight of the house above them, thousands of tons of stone. Suddenly, Elias stopped. He put a finger to his lips. From somewhere above, they heard a rhythmic sound. It was the sound of someone walking on a wooden floor. "The kitchen," Elias breathed. "Stay behind me. If he is there, I will handle him. You must find David and Clara. They are likely locked in the upstairs bedrooms." The drainage tunnel ended at a heavy iron grate. Elias used a small pry bar to lift it, the metal groaning softly. They emerged into the pantry, a small, windowless room filled with jars of preserved fruit and old flour sacks. The air was cold, but it felt remarkably still after the violence of the storm. Sarah stepped out into the kitchen. The room was empty. A single candle had burned down to a puddle of wax on the table. The breakfast soup from the day before was still in the pot, cold and skin-covered. The house felt abandoned, yet Sarah could feel the presence of Marcus like a weight in the air. "Go," Elias whispered. "I will check the study. If the boat arrives, I will signal with the lighthouse lamp. We must get everyone to the dock." Sarah nodded and hurried toward the stairs. She moved like a ghost, her boots making no sound on the thick rugs. When she reached the second floor, she went straight to Clara's room. She turned the handle, but it was locked. "Clara, it's Sarah. Open the door," she whispered urgently. There was a muffled cry from inside. "Sarah, is it really you?" Marcus said. "He said you fell into the sea." "I'm alive. I have Victor. We have to leave now." Sarah looked at the lock. It was a simple skeleton keyhole. She reached into her pocket and found the metal tool she had used in the cellar. She jammed it into the mechanism and twisted. With a sharp, the door swung open. Clara was huddled on the bed, her eyes red from crying. David was there too, sitting on the floor with his back against the wardrobe. He looked defeated. When he saw Sarah, his jaw dropped. "How did you get back?" David asked, scrambling to his feet. "The bridge is gone. We saw it collapse." "There's no time to explain," Sarah said, pulling Clara up. "Elias is here. He's helping us. We have to get to the dock. The boat is coming." "Marcus is in the hallway," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "He's been pacing outside for hours. He keeps talking to himself. He says the island is hungry." "He's not in the hallway now," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Elias is distracting him. We have to move. David, grab your bag. We aren't coming back for anything." They stepped out into the corridor. The silence of the house was terrifying. It felt as though the manor itself was listening to them. As they reached the top of the stairs, a door slammed somewhere on the ground floor. "Who is there?" A voice roared. It was Marcus. He sounded closer than Sarah expected. "Run!" Sarah hissed. They flew down the stairs, their footsteps echoing like thunder. They reached the ground floor and turned toward the back exit that led to the dock path. But as they passed the hallway to the study, Sarah saw the heavy metal door. It was wide open. Standing in the doorway was Marcus. He looked older, 10 years older than he had been the night before. His hair was streaked with grey, and his skin looked like yellow parchment. The preservation was failing. Without the safety of his sanctuary, time was finally catching up. Marcus didn't move. He stood in the frame of the metal door, his hands trembling. The sight of him was shocking. The man who had looked 35 just hours ago now resembled a man in his late 50s. The lines around his eyes were deep, and his shoulders were slumped. The dark stone of the house was no longer protecting him. "You've broken it," Marcus whispered. His voice was no longer a growl. It was a thin, whistling sound. "The cycle. You've let the air in. The rot. It's starting. We're leaving." "Marcus," Sarah said, stepping in front of Clara and David. She held the metal box like a shield. "Elias is here. The truth is out. You can't keep us here anymore." Marcus laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Elias. My brother the martyr. He thinks he's saving you. He's only delivering you to a different kind of ending. Look at me. This is what happens when the island stops caring. I gave it everything. 50 years of my life, spent in these rooms. You chose this," Sarah said. "Now move aside." Marcus stepped forward, but his legs seemed weak. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. David moved to push past him, but Sarah held him back. There was something in Marcus's eyes, a desperate, flickering madness. "The documents." Marcus groaned, reaching out a withered hand. "Give them back. If I put them back in the stone, maybe it will stop. Maybe the clock will turn back." "It's over, Marcus," a voice said from behind him. Elias stepped out of the shadows of the study. He looked at his brother with a mixture of pity and horror. "The house is just a house now. The stone has gone cold. Can't you feel it?" Marcus turned to look at Elias. For a moment, the two brothers simply stared at each other. The resemblance was finally clear. They were the same age, one naturally weathered, the other artificially preserved and now rapidly decaying. "You did this," Marcus whispered. "You brought them here." "I brought the truth here," Elias replied. "Go, Sarah. Take them to the dock. The boat is in the cove." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Clara's hand and pushed David toward the back door. They burst out into the morning air. The mist was lifting, revealing a pale blue sky. Below them, at the end of the long wooden dock, a small white boat was bobbing in the water. They ran down the cliff path, the salt air filling their lungs. It felt like the first time they had breathed in years. Behind them, a long, mournful cry echoed from the manor, a sound that was half human and half wind. They reached the dock just as Captain Miller was securing the lines. He looked up, his eyes wide at the sight of the disheveled group. "Where is the other one?" Miller asked, looking toward the house. "And the tall fellow who hired me?" "He's not coming," Sarah said, her voice gasping. "We have to go. Now. There are injured people. Victor is in the lighthouse. The bridge is down." Miller shouted. "I can't get to the lighthouse." "Elias is there," Sarah said. "He'll bring him. Just get the engines started." As Captain Miller prepped the boat, Sarah looked back at the manor. It sat on the cliff like a dying beast. She could see Elias standing on the balcony, watching them. He wasn't coming yet. He was waiting for something. "I have to go back," Sarah said suddenly. "Are you crazy?" David shouted. "We're almost safe." "The last page of the journal," Sarah said. "I left it in the lighthouse, but there was a mention of a second vault. In the study. If Marcus destroys the records in there, Elias will never be able to reclaim the island legally. The state will take it, and the Guardians will win in a different way." She didn't wait for an answer. She ran back up the dock path. She felt a strange sense of duty to the truth. She reached the house and burst through the back door. The air inside was now incredibly heavy, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. She ran to the study. The metal door was still open. Inside, the room was filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of ledgers. Marcus was on his knees in the center of the room, surrounded by piles of burning paper. He was throwing documents into the small fireplace, his movements frantic. "Stop it!" Sarah cried, rushing forward. Marcus turned. His face was now that of a man in his 80s. His skin was translucent, showing the blue veins beneath. "It all goes to ash," he shrieked. "If I can't have the forever, no one can have the history." Sarah lunged for a stack of ledgers near the desk. These weren't just deeds. They were the Watcher's logs, the daily accounts of everyone who had ever disappeared on Raven Island. This was the evidence the world needed. She grabbed the heavy books, but Marcus lunged at her with a strength born of pure spite. They tumbled to the floor. The fire in the hearth flared up, catching the edge of a heavy curtain. Within seconds, the dry fabric was a wall of flame. "Leave it, Sarah." Elias appeared in the doorway. He rushed forward and pulled her off the floor. "The logs," Sarah shouted, clutching two of the ledgers to her chest. "The house wants them," Elias said, dragging her toward the door. "Let it have them. The cycle has to break." The fire spread with unnatural speed. The old wood, the dry paper, the very air seemed to want to burn. Marcus didn't try to escape. He sat amidst the flames, cradling a handful of ash, a small smile on his ancient, withered face. He was finally going to rest. Elias and Sarah sprinted through the hallway as the ceiling began to groan. They reached the back door and leaped onto the grass just as a section of the roof collapsed, sending a plume of black smoke into the morning sky. The heat from the manor was intense, a physical wall that pushed Sarah and Elias back toward the cliff's edge. The stone walls, which had stood for a century, were now acting like an oven. Black smoke billowed into the clear morning sky, a dark signal that could surely be seen from the mainland. Sarah clutched the two salvaged ledgers to her chest, the leather covers hot to the touch. "We have to get to the boat," Sarah shouted over the roar of the flames. Elias looked back at the burning house one last time. There was no sadness in his eyes, only a profound sense of relief. The prison was melting away. "The dock," he agreed, his voice steady. "The captain won't wait much longer if the fire spreads to the trees." They ran down the winding path, the air growing cooler as they descended toward the water. David and Clara were already on the boat, their faces pale as they watched the inferno above. Captain Miller was standing at the helm, his hand white-knuckled on the throttle. "Where's the other one?" Miller yelled as Sarah and Elias leaped onto the wooden planks of the dock. "He's gone," Sarah said, her voice breathy. "He chose to stay." As Elias climbed onto the boat, he looked toward the lighthouse. "Victor. We still need to get Victor." "The lighthouse is stone," Miller countered. "He's safer there than he is near that forest fire. I'll circle around to the base of the tower. There's a small landing there, but we have to move fast. The wind is shifting, and the smoke will blind us soon." The boat's engine roared to life, a powerful, modern sound that felt completely alien after the days spent in the silence of the manor. As they pulled away from the dock, Sarah looked up. The manor was now a skeleton of fire. Through a window on the second floor, she thought she saw a figure standing perfectly still amidst the flames. It wasn't Marcus as she knew him, but a shadow of a man who had finally run out of time. The boat turned, heading toward the isolated pillar of the lighthouse. The gap where the bridge had been was now a jagged wound in the island's silhouette. The Devil's Throat looked even more treacherous from below, a narrow throat of rock that seemed ready to swallow anything that fell. "There he is." Clara pointed toward the gallery of the lighthouse. Victor was standing at the top, waving a white cloth. He looked small and fragile against the massive stone structure. The boat slowed as it approached the jagged rocks at the base of the tower. Miller maneuvered with expert precision, bringing the hull as close as he dared to the slippery stone landing. "Jump!" Elias roared. Victor hesitated for a second, then climbed over the railing of the lower platform and leaped. David and Elias caught him, pulling him onto the deck. He was shivering, his eyes wide with shock, but he was alive. "The papers," Victor gasped, looking at Sarah. "Did you get them?" Sarah held up the ledgers and the metal box. "I got enough. The world is going to know about Raven Island." The journey back to the mainland was silent. The five of them sat on the deck, watching Raven Island shrink into a small, dark speck on the horizon. The plume of smoke from the manor stayed visible for hours, a black smudge against the blue sky. Elias sat at the stern, staring at the water, his hand resting on the side of the boat as if he was still trying to feel the pulse of the land he had finally left behind. As the coastline of the mainland appeared, the reality of what they had survived began to set in. Sarah looked at her friends. David was clutching his camera bag, though he hadn't taken a single photo of the fire. Clara was wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. They were changed. The island had taken their innocence and replaced it with a heavy, cold knowledge. They reached the small harbor just as the sun was beginning to set. A few fishermen were standing on the pier, watching the strange boat arrive. News of the fire on Raven Island had already reached the shore. The local fire brigade was gathering near the docks, though they knew there was little they could do for an island 3 miles out. "Wait here," Sarah told the others as the boat docked. "I need to call my editor and the police." "Sarah," Elias called out softly. She turned to look at him. He stood up, looking taller than he had on the island. "The documents in that box. They will bring many questions. Some people will not believe you. They will say it was a mass hallucination, or a tragedy caused by the storm." "I have the ledgers, Elias," Sarah said, patting the books. "And I have Victor's journal. Hard evidence doesn't hallucinate. Just remember," Elias said, his eyes turning toward the distant horizon. "The island has a way of protecting its secrets, even when the house is gone. Marcus wasn't the first guard, and if the stone is still there, he might not be the last." Sarah felt a chill. She walked to the nearest payphone, the small town was behind the Times, and dialed the number for the Chronicle. "It's Sarah," she said when her editor picked up. "I have the story, but you're going to need to clear the front page for the next week, and call the authorities in Maine. We found something on Raven Island that shouldn't exist." As she spoke, she watched the police cars pull onto the pier. Officers stepped out, looking confused as they saw the bedraggled group stepping off Miller's boat. Victor was being helped onto a stretcher by local medics. The investigation was about to begin, but Sarah knew that the Real story, the one about the man who stopped time, might be the hardest thing she ever had to write. The police station in the small coastal town was a cramped, 2-story building that smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. Sarah sat in a small room with a flickering fluorescent light, a tape recorder spinning on the table between her and a skeptical-looking detective named Vance. Let me get this straight. Ms. Miller. Vance said, leaning back in his chair. You're claiming the owner of the house, a man you say was nearly 100 years old but looked 30, set fire to the place and stayed inside. I'm telling you what I saw, detective. Sarah said, her voice tired but firm. I have the documents. Have your forensics team look at the birth certificates and the deeds. Cross-reference them with the watcher's logs I brought back. Vance sighed, rubbing his eyes. We've checked the name Marcus Thorne. According to state records, a Marcus Thorne died in 1992. The man who hired you was using a dead man's identity. No. Sarah countered. He was Marcus Thorne. He just never updated his status with the world. He stayed in that house. The environment there. It did something to the aging process. Victor Vance can testify to it. He was held captive there. Mr. Vance is currently in the hospital suffering from severe dehydration and shock. Vance said. His statement is inconsistent. He talks about the breathing of the stone and hidden tunnels. It sounds like trauma. Ms. Miller. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. She opened the metal box, which was now in police evidence. She pointed to a photograph they had found in the study, not the one from the attic, but a more recent one. It showed Marcus standing with a group of men in suits. The date on the back was 1985. He looked exactly as he had when he greeted them at the dock 3 days ago. Look at the people around him. Sarah urged. Those are local officials from 40 years ago. They're all old or dead now. But Marcus hasn't changed a day. How do you explain that? Vance looked at the photo, his expression wavering for a second. Genetics. A family resemblance. It's more than that. Sarah said. The ledgers detail every person who visited that island since the 1950s. Most of them never came back. Check the missing persons reports for the last half-century. Match them to the dates in these books. The detective silenced. He looked at the heavy ledgers. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a property dispute or a kidnapping. This is one of the largest serial disappearances in American history. It wasn't murder. Sarah whispered. It was recruitment. He wanted people to stay. He wanted to prove that his way was better. He wanted to build a world that never had to say goodbye. 2 days later, Sarah was allowed to visit Victor in the hospital. He was sitting up in bed, looking much better, though his eyes still drifted to the window every few minutes, as if checking the horizon for the island. The police are calling it a cult situation. Victor said as Sarah sat down. They can't wrap their heads around the biological side of it. So they're leaning on the idea that Marcus drugged us or used some kind of psychological manipulation. Is that what happened? Victor? Sarah asked. Victor shook his head slowly. No. I felt it. Sarah. When I was in that cellar, before Marcus found me, there was a vibration. Like a low-frequency hum. It made your heart beat slower. It made your mind feel still. I think that stone Marcus talked about was radioactive in a way we don't understand. It didn't kill, it preserved. Elias is gone. Sarah said quietly. Victor looked up, surprised. Gone? What do you mean? He gave his statement to the police, and then he just disappeared. Sarah explained. He didn't want any of the inheritance. He signed the island over to the state as a protected wilderness area. They found his boat abandoned 10 miles down the coast. No note, no sign of a struggle. He went back to the sea. Victor said, a small smile appearing on his face. He told me once that the only way to truly break the island's hold was to return everything to the water. He didn't want to be a guard anymore. He wanted to be a man who finished his journey. The Chronicle wants the story. Victor, Sarah said, pulling out her notebook. But I don't know if I can write it. If I tell the truth about the stone, every treasure hunter and cult leader in the country will head for Raven Island. It'll become a circus. Victor reached out and touched her hand. Then don't tell them about the stone. Tell them about the cost. Tell them about the man who lived for 100 years and died with nothing but a handful of ash in a burning room. Tell them that immortality is just another word for a very long prison sentence. Sarah nodded. She understood. The mystery of the island's geology could remain buried under the charred remains of the manor. The real story was the human tragedy of Marcus Thorne. The police found something in the ruins. Sarah added after a moment. A safe. It was melted shut, but they managed to get it open. It was full of watches. Hundreds of them. All stopped at different times. The moments they stayed. Victor whispered. He kept their time because they couldn't use it anymore. Sarah returned to the coastal town one last time before heading back to the city. She walked along the empty beach, the same shore where she had first met Elias. The air was cold and crisp, and the sound of the Atlantic was a constant, soothing roar. She looked out toward the spot where Raven Island sat. The island was invisible today, hidden by a thick, white fog that had rolled in from the north. It was as if the island had decided to withdraw from the world again, now that its secret had been exposed and its master was gone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the silver half-moon pendant she had found in the library, the one that belonged to the woman in the 1976 photograph, the one who looked like Clara. She had shown it to Clara before they parted ways. Clara had turned it over in her hands, her face a mask of confusion. "I've never seen this before," she had said. "But it feels familiar, like a dream I had a long time ago." Sarah looked at the pendant. She thought about the preservation and the way Marcus had looked at them. Was Clara a descendant of the woman in the photo? Or was there something even darker at play? Had Marcus been trying to recreate a past he could never truly let go of? She walked to the water's edge and threw the pendant as far as she could into the surf. It disappeared, swallowed by the grey waves. "Goodbye, Marcus," she whispered. As she turned to walk away, she saw a figure standing far down the beach. It was a man in a long, dark raincoat. He was looking out at the fog. For a second, her heart stopped. She thought it was Elias, or perhaps the ghost of Marcus himself. She squinted against the wind, but the mist shifted, and the figure was gone. It was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a piece of driftwood. The island was gone, the house was ash, and the secrets were buried. Sarah walked back to her car, her notebook heavy in her bag. She had a story to write. A story about a house on a cliff, a storm that wouldn't end, and the high price of forever. As she drove away from the coast, she didn't look back. She knew that some places weren't meant to be visited twice, and some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. 3 months after the fire, Sarah sat in the cold, windowless basement of the state records office. The air was thick with the scent of vinegar and old paper, the smell of microfilm. While the world had largely moved on from the Raven Island tragedy, Sarah could not. The official report had concluded that Marcus Thorne was a squatter with a delusional obsession, and the disappearances were chalked up to a series of tragic boating accidents over the decades. But Sarah knew better. She adjusted the lens of the microfilm reader, her eyes stinging from hours of staring at flickering white text. She was looking for the name of the woman in the 1976 photograph, the woman who looked like Clara. "There you are," she whispered. A marriage certificate appeared on the screen. June 12, 1974. Marcus Thorne and Elena Vance. Sarah froze. Vance. The same last name as Victor. She scrolled further, her heart racing. Elena Vance had disappeared in the fall of 1977. The police report at the time was brief. Presumed drowned near the Devil's Throat. Body not recovered. Sarah pulled a folder from her bag. It contained the genealogical research she had commissioned on Clara's family. Clara's grandmother had been an orphan, adopted by a family in Ohio in 1978. There were no records of her biological parents. He wasn't just obsessed with the past. Sarah realized, the coldness of the room seeping into her bones. He was trying to rebuild a family he had destroyed. Marcus hadn't just been a guard. He was a man trying to undo a tragedy. The stone had given him time, but it hadn't given him the power to bring back the dead. He had spent 50 years looking for a replacement for Elena. When he saw Clara in the city, perhaps by chance, perhaps by design, he saw a ghost. The holiday invitation hadn't been a random act of kindness to an old friend. It was a summons. Marcus had brought Clara to the island to complete a circle that had been broken decades ago. Sarah stood up, her legs stiff. She needed to tell Clara. But how? How do you tell someone that their entire existence was a target for a century-old madman? As she exited the archive, the bright sun of the city felt artificial. The shadows of Raven Island were long, and they reached much further than she had ever imagined. The phone in Sarah's apartment rang at 2 a.m. In the silence of the night, it sounded like a scream. Sarah, who had been sleeping fitfully, bolted upright. She stared at the device on her nightstand. No one called her at this hour unless it was an emergency. "Hello," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "Sarah, it's David." David's voice was different. Thin, vibrating with a frantic energy. Since their return, he had become a recluse, rarely leaving his apartment in Brooklyn. "David, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I developed the film. Sarah." He whispered. "The rolls from the night of the storm. The ones I thought were ruined by the sea spray." Sarah sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist. "And what did you find?" "I was looking at the shots I took in the hallway," David said, his breathing heavy. "The ones near the metal door. You remember how dark it was? I used a high-speed film, pushing the exposure to the limit." "David, just tell me. There's someone else in the photos." "Sarah. Not Marcus. Not us. Behind you, when you were standing at the door with the broken key, there's a reflection in the silver plating of the lock." Sarah felt a bead of sweat roll down her spine. "Who is it?" "It's a woman," David said, his voice breaking. "She's standing right behind you. She's wearing a white dress, and her hand is reaching for your shoulder. Sarah, she's transparent. You can see the wood grain through her face. It's a double exposure, David," Sarah said, trying to convince herself. The camera was wet. The light was flickering. "I thought so too," David replied. "But I checked the other frames. She's in all of them. In the kitchen. In the cellar. She's following us. Sarah. And she's not in the photos from the harbor. She only appears once we crossed the water." "Elena," Sarah whispered. "Who?" "Marcus's wife. She died there, David. Or she never left." "There's one more thing," David said, his voice dropping to a terrifying low. "I took a photo of the boat as we were leaving. The one where we're all on the deck. I counted the people. Sarah, there are 6 of us. Someone is sitting in the back of the boat, near the engines. Someone with long, dark hair." Sarah looked at her bedroom door, suddenly terrified that it would open. "Where are the photos now, David?" "I burned them," David said. "I burned the prints and the negatives. But I can't unsee her. She's still there. Sarah. I can feel her in the room with me. The line went dead. Sarah arrived at David's apartment at dawn. She pounded on the door, but there was no answer. The hallway smelled of old cooking oil and floor wax. She called his name, her voice echoing off the grimy walls. Finally, she used the spare key he had given her months ago for emergencies. The apartment was a wreck. Gear was scattered everywhere. Lenses, tripods, and rolls of film lay on the floor like oversized shells. David was sitting in the corner of his darkroom, the red light casting a bloody hue over his face. He was staring at a blank piece of photo paper. "She's gone," he said without looking up. "David, look at me," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. "You're exhausted. You're having a breakdown. The island, it did this to us. It's PTSD." "It's not a breakdown, Sarah," David said, finally turning to her. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated. "I went to the hospital yesterday to see Victor. I wanted to ask him if he saw her too. And Victor died, Sarah, 2 nights ago. The doctors said it was heart failure. Sudden and total. Like his body just forgot how to keep time." Sarah felt the world tilt. Victor was the strongest of them, the one who had survived the cellar. Why didn't anyone call me? Because he didn't have any next of kin. David said. "And Elias? Elias is still missing. There was no one to notify." Sarah looked at the empty developing trays. The preservation of the island hadn't just been a physical effect. It was a tether. Marcus had said the island didn't like to let go. Maybe Victor hadn't died of heart failure. Maybe he had simply run out of the time the island had been lending him. "We have to find Clara," Sarah said, standing up. "She's the one Marcus wanted. If the tether is pulling Victor back, Clara is in the most danger. She's not at her apartment," David said. "I called her a dozen times. Her roommate says she went on a trip. A heritage tour. Someone sent her a letter with information about her biological parents." "Marcus," Sarah breathed. "Even from the grave, he's still pulling the strings." "Not Marcus," David said, pointing to a small envelope on the table. "Look at the postmark." Sarah picked it up. The postmark wasn't from the coast. It was from a small town in the Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles from the sea. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same elegant, old-fashioned script Marcus had used in his invitation. "He didn't die in the fire," Sarah said. "A man who can stop time doesn't die from a few flames." The drive to the mountains took 10 hours. Sarah and David drove in silence, the car climbing higher and higher into the mist-covered peaks. The landscape was the polar opposite of Raven Island, thick forests of pine and hemlock instead of salt and stone, but the feeling of isolation was the same. They found the address at the end of a long, unpaved road. It was a cabin made of dark logs, tucked into the shadow of a towering cliff. It looked peaceful, but to Sarah, it looked like a cage. Clara's car was parked in the driveway. Sarah stepped out of the car, her hand gripping the heavy iron flashlight she had brought from the city. "Clara!" she shouted. "Clara! It's Sarah. Are you in there?" The front door of the cabin opened. Clara stepped out. She looked rested, her face glowing with a health that seemed almost unnatural. She was wearing a dress Sarah didn't recognize, a simple, high-collared white dress from another era. "Sarah, David, what are you doing here?" Clara asked, a strange, distant smile on her face. "Clara, you have to leave," Sarah said, walking toward her. "You're in danger. Whoever sent you that letter, it's a trap." "No, Sarah," Clara said, her voice soft and melodic. "It's not a trap. It's a gift. I found them. My family. They've been waiting for me for so long." "Clara, your family is dead," David said, his voice trembling. "We checked the records. There's no one left." "That's what the world thinks," Clara said, stepping aside. Standing in the shadows of the cabin was a man. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, blue eyes. He looked 35 years old. He was wearing a clean suit, his hair perfectly combed. On his left cheek was a thin, white scar in the shape of a half-moon. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said. His voice was no longer a whistle. It was the strong, confident baritone of the man who had first greeted them at the harbor. The fire had not killed him. It had seemingly reset him. "How?" Sarah whispered, her knees shaking. "We saw the house burn. We saw you in the window." "The house was a shell," Marcus said, stepping onto the porch. "The power isn't in the stones of the manor, Sarah. It's in the earth. And the earth is the same everywhere, if you know where to look. I found a new vein here. A deeper one." He reached out and took Clara's hand. She didn't pull away. She looked at him with a devotion that turned Sarah's stomach. "Clara, look at him." Sarah screamed. "He's a monster. He's using you. He's my father, Sarah." Clara said. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The records, the missing page. She had misread the connection. Clara wasn't the replacement for Elena. She was the daughter Elena had died to protect. Marcus hadn't been looking for a wife. He had been looking for his heir. "She doesn't know, does she?" Sarah asked, her voice steadying. "She doesn't know what happened to her mother." Marcus's face darkened for a split second, the mask of youth flickering. Elena didn't understand the gift. She tried to take Clara away. She tried to break the circle. "I had to protect the legacy." "You killed her," David said, stepping forward. "You killed your own wife because she wanted your daughter to have a normal life. I gave her a life that never ends." Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the cliffs. "A life without the rot of time. Is that a crime?" Clara looked between them, the distant smile faltering. "Father. What are they talking about? You said Mother went away to be safe." "She is safe, Clara," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a soothing whisper. "She's here. She's in the trees. She's in the air. Just like you will be." Sarah realized then that the preservation wasn't just about the body. It was a psychological trap. Marcus had spent 50 years perfecting his lies, waiting for the moment he could reclaim the one piece of his life that had escaped him. "Clara, listen to me," Sarah said, stepping onto the first porch step. "We have the ledgers. We have the truth. He's been keeping you a prisoner since before you were born. You're not his daughter, you're his property." Marcus lunged, his hand moving with a speed that was impossible for a human. He gripped Sarah's throat, lifting her off her feet. His grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. "You should have stayed in the city, journalist," Marcus hissed. "You've interfered for the last time." Suddenly, a loud, sharp sound echoed through the woods. Marcus's grip loosened. He looked down at his chest. A small, dark hole had appeared in his suit jacket. Sarah fell to the deck, gasping for air. She looked toward the tree line. Standing there, silhouetted against the rising sun, was Elias. He was holding an old hunting rifle, his face set in a grim expression of duty. "I told you, Marcus," Elias said, walking forward. "The watch is finished." Marcus looked at the blood on his hand. It wasn't red, it was a dark, thick black, like oil. He looked at Elias, then at Clara. The preservation was breaking again. The wound wasn't healing. The mountain. Marcus gasped, his voice turning into that thin, dry whistle. The vein. It's not strong enough. He tumbled backward, falling off the porch and onto the grass. As he hit the ground, his body began to gray. The years he had stolen were returning all at once. His skin wrinkled, his hair turned to ash, and his eyes sank into his skull. Within seconds, the man who looked 35 was a pile of ancient, brittle bones. Clara screamed, a long, harrowing sound that broke the silence of the forest. Elias reached her first, pulling her away from the remains of her father. "It's over, child," Elias said softly. "The circle is finally broken." Sarah stood up, her throat bruised and her heart heavy. She looked at the pile of bones on the grass. Marcus Thorne had finally met the one thing he couldn't negotiate with: the end. The silence that followed Marcus's collapse was heavier than the darkness of the island. Sarah stood on the porch, her hand over her bruised throat, watching the wind scatter the fine, grey ash that had once been a man. Clara was sobbing into Elias's shoulder, her white dress now stained with the dark, oily residue of the preservation. Elias lowered the rifle, his old eyes fixed on the spot where his brother had fallen. He looked more tired than Sarah had ever seen him. The burden of being the final guard had etched deep lines into his weathered face. He could never just let it go. Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He thought he could transplant the curse. He thought the earth would forgive him if he found a new altar. "How did you find us, Elias?" David asked, his voice shaking as he moved to Sarah's side. "I never truly left you," Elias replied, looking at Sarah. "I knew the fire wouldn't be enough." Marcus was a creature of habit. He always had a secondary sanctuary, a place our father bought long ago when the world first started to change. I followed the pull. Those of us who have lived near the stone, we can feel the pulse of it, even from miles away. Sarah looked at the cabin. It was a beautiful structure, but now it felt like a tomb. "Is it here too, Elias? The thing that stops time?" Elias shook his head. "A weak vein. Enough to sustain him for a few weeks, but not enough to hold back the tide of 80 years once the blood starts to flow. The mountain didn't want him. It only tolerated him." Clara pulled away, looking at the pile of clothes and bones on the grass. Her eyes were vacant, the light of the heritage she thought she had found now extinguished. "He said he loved me," she whispered. "He said I was the only thing that mattered." "He loved the reflection of himself in you, Clara," Elias said gently. "He loved the idea that he could continue through you. That isn't love. That's a hostage situation." Sarah walked down the steps, her legs finally steady. She looked at the cabin, then at the deep, dark woods surrounding them. "We have to call it in. The police, the authorities, they need to see this." "No," Elias said, his voice firm. "They will see a pile of old bones and 3 traumatized people. They will call it a murder or a hoax. Let the mountain have him. The rain will wash the ash into the soil, and the woods will grow over this place. It's the only way to make sure the cycle truly ends." They spent the day clearing the cabin. Elias insisted on burning every scrap of paper Marcus had brought with him. As Sarah helped, she found a small, hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. Inside was a single, leather-bound volume. It wasn't a log of visitors or a record of deeds. It was a personal diary, written in the same elegant script. Sarah sat on the porch and opened it to the last entry, dated only 2 days ago. "The girl is here. She has Elena's eyes, but she lacks her mother's fire. That is good. Fire destroys. Stillness preserves. The mountain here is cold, but it whispers the same promises. We will start again. I will teach her the silence. I will teach her that the world outside is a theater of rot, and only here is the performance eternal. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. Marcus hadn't seen Clara as a daughter. He had seen her as a blank page to be written upon. He had intended to erase her personality, her memories, and her humanity until she was nothing more than a statue in his private gallery. Sarah, David said, coming out of the house. We found something else. In the back room. Sarah followed him to a small, windowless chamber. It was filled with clocks. Hundreds of them, just like in the manor. But these were all running. The ticking was a chaotic, overlapping sound that made Sarah's head spin. He was trying to sync them. David whispered. He was trying to command time again. Elias walked into the room, holding a heavy iron mallet. Without a word, he began to smash the clocks. One by one, the glass faces shattered, and the springs coiled out like metallic snakes. The room fell into a silence that felt like a physical weight. Time is a gift, Elias said, his chest heaving. Only a thief tries to keep it in a box. They carried the last of Marcus's belongings to a clearing and set them ablaze. As the smoke rose into the mountain air, Sarah realized that the watchers were finally gone. There was no one left to guard the secrets, and no one left to be guarded by them. The drive back to New York was long and silent. They left Elias at a bus station in a small mountain town. He refused to come with them, saying he had one more journey to take. A journey to the coast to find a place where the sea met the sky. Don't look for me, he had told Sarah. And don't look for the island. The maps will change, and the fog will return. Let it be a ghost. When they reached the city, the noise and the lights felt overwhelming. The constant motion of the streets, the ticking of the subway clocks, the aging faces in the crowd. It was all a reminder of the rot Marcus had feared so much. But to Sarah, it felt beautiful. It felt real. Clara moved in with Sarah for a few weeks. She didn't speak much, spending most of her time staring out the window at the skyline. She was slowly relearning how to be a person who lived in the present. The health she had gained at the cabin faded, replaced by the normal, tired pallor of someone who had survived a great trauma. She was aging again, and she welcomed it. David returned to his photography, but his style had changed. He no longer took photos of buildings or landscapes. He took portraits of people, old people, with deep wrinkles and stories written in their skin. He called his new series The Beauty of the End. Sarah sat at her typewriter, the two ledgers from the manor sitting on her desk. She had tried to write the story a dozen times, but the words always felt inadequate. How do you describe the feeling of time standing still? How do you explain a man who died twice? She realized that Victor had been right. The story wasn't about the science or the stone. It was about the cost of forever. She began to type. Raven Island does not appear on most modern charts. To the locals, it is a legend. To the state, it is a liability. But to those who have stepped onto its grey shores, it is a warning. It is a place where the human soul is traded for a few extra years, and the price of immortality is a silence that never ends. Months passed. The Chronicle published Sarah's series, but she had stripped away the names and the exact locations. It was presented as a long-form meditation on isolation and the darker side of the human desire for longevity. It won awards, but Sarah didn't care. She had achieved what she wanted. She had told the truth without giving the world a map. One afternoon, a package arrived at her apartment. It was wrapped in brown paper and smelled of salt. Inside was a small, smooth sea stone and a handwritten note from Elias. The island is gone, Sarah. A massive shelf of rock collapsed during a winter storm. The manor, the lighthouse, and the Devil's Throat. All of it is at the bottom of the Atlantic now. The earth has taken back what it lent. There is nothing left to guard. Sarah held the stone in her hand. It felt cold, but it didn't hum. It didn't vibrate. It was just a rock. She felt a final, massive weight lift from her shoulders. The tether was broken. The preservation was finally over for everyone. She called Clara and David. They met at a small cafe in the West Village. It was a rainy day, the kind that would have felt ominous months ago, but now it just felt like a Tuesday. "I heard about the island," David said, stirring his coffee. "The news reported a minor earthquake off the coast." "It's better this way," Clara said. She looked better than Sarah had ever seen her. She was working at a library now, surrounded by books that told the history of a world she was finally part of. No more ghosts. No more ghosts. Sarah agreed. They sat together for hours, talking about nothing in particular. Their jobs, their plans, the small dramas of their daily lives. They were three people who had seen the edge of forever and turned back. They were older, they were tired, and they were perfectly, wonderfully mortal. As they left the cafe, Sarah saw her reflection in the window. She noticed a few grey hairs at her temples that hadn't been there before. She smiled. Each one was a trophy. Each one was a sign that she was moving forward. The sun set over the Hudson River, casting a long, golden light over the city. Sarah walked through the park, watching the children play and the old men play chess. She reached into her pocket and felt the sea stone Elias had sent her. She walked to the edge of the water and looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere, far to the northeast, the Atlantic was rolling over the ruins of Raven Island. The fishes would swim through the broken windows of the manor, and the silt would cover the watchers' logs. The metal box she had fought so hard to save was now just a collection of papers in a secure evidence locker, destined to be forgotten by everyone except the few who knew the truth. She thought about Marcus Thorne. In the end, he had gotten what he wanted, a kind of immortality. Not in the stone, but in the story she had written. He would live on as a cautionary tale, a ghost in the pages of a magazine. "The watch is finished," she whispered to the wind. She took the sea stone and tossed it into the Hudson. It made a small, clean splash and vanished into the dark water. She didn't wait to see the ripples. She turned her back on the water and walked toward the lights of the city. The world was moving. The clocks were ticking. People were growing old, falling in love, and saying goodbye. It was a messy, loud, and beautiful performance, and Sarah Miller was finally glad to be part of the audience. The mystery of Raven Island was a closed book. The fire had burned the house, the sea had swallowed the stone, and the wind had scattered the ash. All that remained was the time they had left, and for the first time in her life, Sarah knew exactly how precious that was. She checked her watch. It was 6 p.m. She was meeting David and Clara for dinner in 20 minutes. She started to walk faster. She didn't want to be late. She didn't want to miss a single second.